Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. This is part 2 of my 2-part deep dive into the life and career of Joni Mitchell. If you haven't listened to part 1 or you just want a quick refresh before we dive into part 2, we finished up last time talking about evolution as an artist and how you always have to be finding the new in your creative process so that you can evolve. And we're going to pick up today exactly where we left off, talking about how Joni was someone who was constantly evolving, and as a result of that, you couldn't really label her or put her in a box. But before we get into it, I want to remind you that if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the Artwell podcast. Next week, I'm going to be uploading an audio exclusive bonus content episode of all of the material that I learned studying Joni Mitchell that didn't make it into the deep dive. My bonus content document right now is over 10 pages long, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. And if you want to get even more out of Artwell, then you should subscribe to the Artwell newsletter. Once the deep dive is done, part 1 and part 2 has come out, I'm going to send out a newsletter with all of the lessons that we talked about, written as these short little one-liners, these maxims to help make them memorable. You can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter now at the link in the show notes. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited to present to you part 2 of my deep dive into the life and career of Joni Mitchell.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
Because Joni Mitchell could not be put into a box. She couldn't be categorized. And people are able to do that when you fall back on your habits consistently enough. You know, if you just continually do the same thing, eventually people are just going to place you in a box. And the problem with that is you can start to believe those labels. You know, Keith Jarrett talked about how your style can be limiting. Having a style is actually what can allow people to put you in a box. And he spent a large part, or part of the early part of his career, I should say, trying to figure out what his style was. And he said the moment he realized, he can remember, he said he was on stage and he kind of figured out what his style was. And he said the most important thing for him to do in that moment was to forget that style. Because when you have a quote unquote style as an artist, you're always going to default to working in that way. It is going to become habitual, which, like when I had the Keith Jarrett quote I read, a habit becomes an anchor. It holds you in place. It prevents you from exploring. It prevents you from going on an adventure as an artist. And so when he realized what his style was, he immediately shed it. And he did not concern himself with style whatsoever, because for Keith Jarrett, it was always about the music over everything else. And his style could prevent him from creating music that communicated the emotion he was trying to communicate in the best way. And Joni Mitchell was the exact same way. She was always experimenting with her style for the sake of finding the best way to communicate the emotions she had inside of her. And so you can't really categorize Joni Mitchell, but that does not mean that people didn't try to. Throughout her entire career, people were throwing labels at her, and throughout her entire career, she was trying to knock those labels down. She said, I'm not a jazzer, I'm not a rock and roller, I'm not a folkie, I'm just a musician. I just go in and out of these fields, at will, which is a very luxurious position. The more experimentative you become, by that I mean willing to take chances, the more chances open up to you. That last line is so important. The more experimentative you become, by that I mean willing to take chances, the more chances open up to you. And chances, I think, when I hear that, I'm sure you might be thinking the same thing, is when I hear chances, I think of in a career sense, like more opportunities, which could be very valid. But I think there's also a reading of that quote, which is something along the lines of like, these chances that come to you, that open up to you, are chances to try something you've never tried before artistically, in Joni's case musically, that only present themselves because they did an experiment, because they went on the edge of succeeding and failing. And that is why Joni refused to be put in a box, because, as Keith Jarrett discussed, it became limiting. And this is something that Joni knew, whether intellectually or just intuitively, from the very early days of her career. I had this quote from 1966 where she said, "I only hope that I never have to be categorized, just to feel that I am a musician." And while she, as an artist, certainly never accepted the categories or the labels that people placed on her, she definitely struggled with that throughout her entire career. From the beginning of her career up until the end of her career, she was always answering questions about this. But again, like I said, even at the beginning of her career, some executives passed on her because they couldn't categorize her. Like they would hear Joni and they'd be like, "Wow, you're amazing, but I just don't know what box to put you in, so I can't sign you." And there's two ways of interpreting this story. And one of them is in the like pure artistic sense. And one of them is the sense of like, you want to make sure your art gets out into the world. And in Joni's sense, her art did get out into the world. So that might not necessarily apply to Joni. But the first reading of this is that the most interesting artists are the ones you can't necessarily categorize. I've been talking about Tyler, the Creator, throughout this. I'm going to talk about him again later on in this deep dive. But he's one who it's like, he's a rapper, but he's also not. Like he makes rap music, but he's also this like creative director. He has a fashion label. Like he's all of these things that to just call him a rapper is very reductive. And there's a reason I keep talking about him, because I think he's one of the most interesting artists on the planet today. And you can't categorize him. And that is part of what makes him so interesting. And so if you find yourself, if you're somebody who likes to identify talent, if you find someone who you can't categorize, who what they do is too unique, too distinct, there's some magic there. And Joni Mitchell was like that. And the executives at the time viewed that as a negative thing, but I actually think the reading of that is a positive thing. And you just find those people and you empower those people, they are going to make some powerful art. That's what Joni did. She made some powerful art. And I think that these interesting artists who you can't categorize are few and far between. And so the reading for, and this comes back to this awareness piece of knowing who you are and the type of artist you are. If we come back to the more, I guess like the business reading of this, is that how you package yourself matters. Right? Like Joni wasn't concerned with her presentation. She wasn't concerned with any labels or any categories. She was just herself. Which again, I think that is the optimum thing to strive for as an artist, but also to consider the fact that how you package yourself matters, especially in a social media world when people are seeing you in quick glimpses. And I understand that might not be the way you want the world to work, but unfortunately that is the world we live in. And so how you package yourself, how you come across to people matters. And early in Joni's career, people weren't really sure how she was packaged or how to package her. And she ran into some struggles in terms of getting signed from executives. But again, I think that if you find somebody who you can't categorize, that is a signal that there's something special happening here. You know, like when you look at Tyler, the Creator as the example, is like early in his career, he's like making rap music, but he's also making skit videos, and he has a show on Adult Swim, and he's directing his own music videos, and he's just doing so many things. It's like you can't put him into a box, and that is actually a special thing, especially when the person you're trying to put into a box that doesn't fit in that box doesn't fit because they're so good at so many things. Like, I'm not talking about somebody who's like just so chaotic and they just can't commit to one thing. Like someone like a Joni Mitchell or a Tyler, the Creator, they do so many things at such a high level. Like Joni is a singer, but she's also a painter, and she's incredibly gifted at both of those things. Tyler's music videos are sometimes just as beautiful as his music. And so when I say they are the most interesting because they do so many things, they have to do those things well. I'm not talking about somebody who is just interested by a lot of things and can't commit to any one thing and kind of does a bunch of things half-assed. That's not interesting. Interesting is somebody who you can't put into a box because they're so good at so many things. I want to sidebar here quickly on this idea of the fact that Joni had trouble getting signed early on in her career because they couldn't categorize her. And while in the moment, that probably feels like a negative thing, right? Like you want this thing to work, you want to make money from your music, which she was doing, but obviously she's trying to take her career to the next level, is in that time period, she recorded like 20 to 25 great songs. Or she wrote, at least, maybe not recorded, but she wrote 20, 25 great songs before anybody even knew who she was, really. And like the way her manager, Elliot Roberts, described these songs, like these were songs that people wish they could have by the end of their career. Like if they had a body of work that contained these 20 to 25 songs, that would be considered a good career. And Joni Mitchell wrote that, not only that quantity, but that quality before her career even really began. And this is a point I hammer on a lot on this show. It's something you can clearly tell that I think about, is getting good in obscurity. Like, I know it's hard when you're making this thing and you're putting it out into the world and nobody's watching it. But that is an opportunity for you to experiment and for you to get really, really good. This is something I picked up on the last, and this is not me saying I'm like really good, but like this is something I picked up on when I was editing the Keith Jarrett podcast. Actually, I'm going to take you all the way back. I'm going to take you back to my very first podcast that I ever did. It was an interview with my friend Hayden Cashin. And in that interview, I had a lot of vocal fillers. I would say yeah after every question. There were ums. And I spent hours cutting out all of the yeahs and all of the ums. And that was in 2018. This is 2025. 2018? Wow. I've been podcasting for 7 years. And I was editing the Keith Jarrett podcast recently. And I made the decision. I was like, look, I just want to get this out into the world. I'll remove some really bad ums, but for the most part, I'm just going to kind of get this out there as raw and pure as I can. And I realized after a while, there weren't really that many ums at all. And I was kind of had a moment, was like, whoa, like there was a level of development here in my presentation quality to the camera that I wasn't realized was happening. But that just means that when somebody discovers this show, if this is your first time watching Artwell, you're going to have a listening experience or a watching experience that doesn't have a lot of vocal fillers. Sometimes I'll say "and" for a long time. That's one of them, and I'm aware of that. But I don't usually say too much. Versus if I'd gotten a lot of attention off my first year of podcasting, there would have been a lot of annoying vocal fillers that people or audio ticks, whatever you want to call them, that people would have listened to that may have put some people off. But now I am far more polished as a presenter, as a podcaster, so that when you listen to this show, the quality of my delivery to you about these lessons is far better than they would have been if you started listening to me when I first started podcasting. And so while it sucks that not a lot of people listen to this show, my first show, I think we capped out at 60,000 downloads in the first 4 years. I only did it for 4 years. Is like I can see now that I'm actually getting better. And therefore the experience when somebody discovers this show is going to be better. I'm using this opportunity in obscurity to get better and better at what it is that I do, so that when people do discover me, it increases the likelihood of them sticking around because they are impressed with what it is that I have given them in this show. And Joni Mitchell was doing that with her songwriting. People couldn't categorize her, so they weren't giving her the opportunity she definitely deserved. But as a result, she was able to get really, really good at songwriting, so that when the opportunity came for her to put out music, she had great songs already written, so that by the time she finally got a deal, she basically had 3 solid records already done. She came as, you could say, a complete package. When it was finally time, she got good in obscurity. She put reps in. She toured up and down the East Coast, doing little shows, getting good on stage, writing material, living a life that enforced some of her music. And then when the time came, she was able to make the most of it. that is the end of my sidebar on this Get Good at Obscurity. I think anytime there's an opportunity for me to talk about it on this show, I'm going to bring it up. And the crazy part is a lot of the artists that we're going to talk about on this show probably had a period in obscurity that no one talks about because we only were focused on the highlights. But a lot of that early development happens when nobody's watching. So take this opportunity now. If nobody is watching you, take that opportunity and use it wisely. And this isn't saying like you should intentionally be obscure. Like if you have an opportunity, take that opportunity. But if that opportunity has not come to you yet, that's okay. Keep getting better. Like Steve Martin says, get to a point where you're so good that they can't ignore you. Now, officially end of sidebar. We're moving on back to talking about Joni being a uncategorizable artist. She's so unique that people don't even know what to do with her. And the reason Joni was so unique is because Joni Mitchell never wanted to be anybody else other than Joni Mitchell. Somebody else's success meant nothing to her. She wouldn't want to pander to an audience and be something she was not. So there's only a certain amount of fine work in any idiom. The rest of it is just copyists, regurgitation, obvious ripoffs. Charles Mingus, the jazz bassist, has a song, "If Charlie Parker was a gunslinger, there'd be a whole lot of dead copycats. Sometimes I find myself sharing this point of view. He figured you don't settle for anything else but uniqueness. The name of the game to him," this being Charles Mingus, "and to me is to become a full individual. I remember a time when I was very flattered if somebody told me that I was as good as Peter, Paul, and Mary, or that I sounded like Judy Collins. Then one day I discovered I didn't want to be a second-rate anything. I have to remember to be compassionate. Otherwise, it really pisses me off to hear somebody getting a whole lot of public roar and, oh, this is the newest and the greatest, when it's really the newest and greatest copy. There are bands coming now that are really good. They're interesting. They've got some vitality and some fire. But say they're Englishmen who sound like Bob Dylan. I listen to it and it's pleasant on the radio. But as an artist, I say to myself, if you're that good, how come you can't be yourself? That last line is so good. If you're that good, how come you can't be yourself? And I think this idea that she's talking about of so much of what becomes popular is just a copy of something else is very relevant, especially today where it feels like no matter your field, the playbook you're given is figure out what worked for somebody else and how can you basically redo that. Or just redo what somebody else has done to get a similar level of result. And I think if you posed that question to a lot of people, if you're that good, how come you can't be yourself? It would make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Where you realize maybe you're not actually as good as you think you are if your key to success is to do what somebody else has done. And this is part of where I say we have a lot of great craftspeople in the world today. People who can make good sounding music, people who can make good videos for the internet, but they're not making anything that they really have to say. They're just making things that they know people are listening to right now, that people are watching right now. And again, I think we just live in a world now too, where people get inspired to do creative pursuits, not because of the work, but because of the results. They want to become famous. They want the adoration from a crowd of people. And that is what encourages them to pick up the guitar for the first time or to pick up a camera for the first time. It's not, I listened to this piece of music and it changed me. How can I now make something that will change someone else? It's, wow, I want the lifestyle that person has. Okay, how can I reverse engineer what they do to do it for myself to get a similar kind of thing? Like that is just, again, and what Joni says too is not the idea of like, she doesn't hate those people who do that. And I don't want to come across that I hate the people who do that either. If that's what you want to do, if that's genuinely what makes you happy, is it just the results? Go for it. But I find that hard to believe that the results are going to make you happy. But what Joni says is like, look, it's pleasant on the radio, but as an artist, it's as an artist. And this, if you're listening to this show, I assume you are a creative person or an artist, depending on how you view yourself. And the reason, again, like I talked about, the reason we make these things is for the thing itself, which is interesting because my podcasting originally started as just a way for me to grow on social media, to learn how to grow on social media. But what's funny is I eventually got so fed up with that as an idea that I now do art well. Like my old show was about social media, and I got so frustrated with the idea of that. I realized in the process of doing that show that I'm more artistic than I ever gave myself credit for. I thought I was this business guy with a little bit of creativity, but I actually had the realization that I'm actually a creative, artistic guy with a little bit of business, and I've just been restricting this artistic side of my brain because I've been telling myself I'm this business guy. And so when I was doing this show to learn how to, what everyone else has done so I could copy their strategies and do it for myself, it was in the process of trying to learn all of that I went, wait a second, this feels kind of empty. Like, I don't want to get success doing something I don't care about doing. And over the course of that process, Artwell was born. And Artwell is a show that studies the greats. And the greats consistently rally on this point of being original and not copying what has come before. You know, Joni puts it, and she is one of the greats. I have this perverse need for originality. I don't really care for copy. Second generation artists, I'm not a traditionalist. It's the discoverers that excite me. Not new like a new face, the way new is used to sell something. They're not new at all. They're a new person doing the old shit. Doing the old shit. And this is kind of like what I talked about with John Cawley, where he was saying how so many movies today and so many writers are mediating their writing through 20th century films. And Keith Jarrett even talks about, he has this idea of we have to learn to forget about music. This is specifically in regards to his Cologne concert, which is one of the greatest jazz piano performances of all time. One of the greatest jazz. It's a phenomenal record. And he said, when asked about the impact of this record, he said, we also have to learn to forget music. Otherwise, we become addicted to the past, become addicted to trying to do what came before. But the purpose, Joni's purpose, like we've talked about, is to explore new territory, to move forward. And she says that one of the ways that she was able to do that is because she didn't have musical idols that led her to making music, right? Like she made music because she liked making music. She wasn't somebody who was inspired by a celebrity and started making music when she wasn't aspiring to be like anyone. She talks about so many of the generation after her came up as kids doing air guitar in their mirror in their bedroom because they're trying to be just like their idol. She said nearly anyone you talk to in my generation had a hero that they studied and analyzed and strove to be like. They did air guitar in front of the mirror. So it was less muse than ick. Music comes from the muse, not from other musicians, which is like another Keith Jarrett saying as well, where he says, music does not come from music. Music comes from silence. And if you spend too much time listening to music, what you make is going to end up to be too influenced by what it is that you've heard. And so Joni is very much the same way here, which is music comes from the muse, not from other musicians, right? And Keith differs a little bit on this point of not from other musicians, because Keith says when you listen to a song, you don't want to be inspired by the music. You don't want to be inspired by the musician. You want to be inspired by the spirit of the musician. Like, what is the thing that compelled them to make their own art? And how can you capture that spirit for yourself and go and make your own art? You don't want to necessarily, like, for example, if you hear a really sad song that resonates with you in some sort of way, the takeaway is in how can I make a song that sounds like the sad song? It's like, how can I take this feeling, the spirit behind that song, and express it in my own way? with Art Well being a show that studies the past, this kind of feels like I'm speaking against the whole ethos of this show of like studying the greats to become one of the greats. But the caveat here is we study the greats not so that we can retrace their footsteps. We study the greats so that we can pick up where they left off and keep moving forward, right? I'm not telling you how to make like the greats. I'm trying to give you their lessons so you can take the knowledge of what they learned over the course of their entire career and apply the lessons to your career. You're not trying to sound like Joni Mitchell. You're not trying to sound like Keith Jarrett. You're not trying to write a screenplay like George Miller or tell jokes like Robin Williams. You're trying to learn the lessons and apply them to yourself so that you can make your own art in your own unique way. We're not becoming addicted to the past. We are looking at the past to not to guide our way forward, but to help us chart our own path. But the thing is, when you do that, when you make something new and you put it out into the world, is it often requires patience. Patience in order to find it, and patience in order for it to be accepted. Because like we talked about already, when you're trying to discover the new, you're kind of just like eliminating things that you don't want to find this new thing that you're seeking. Is Joni says it's kind of hard to please. She's kind of hard to please because she's looking for something fresh that she hasn't heard before, but she can't ask for it because she doesn't know what it is yet. And so part of this process, and this is part of why people copy, is because it's so much easier and is less uncomfortable, right? Like to try and find the new, to try and make something that you don't know what it is, but you don't know what it is that you're making, requires a lot of time of just sitting in the chair with nothing to write. Sitting in the chair, beating your head against a wall. Because I think part of like with this muse conversation we've been having is like, yes, you have to not be thinking of the muse in order for the muse to find you. But that doesn't mean you can give up on the practice of doing the work. Like you still have to try. And it is through this process of elimination of you trying things, sitting in the chair, beating your head against the wall, trying sentences, trying different words. Eventually it is going to give the muse enough information about what it is you're trying to get to give you the inspiration. You can't just hit a block and give up. You can't be trying to find the new, like, that's not it. I'm just going to quit until I get inspiration. Like, no, you have to still show up. You have to have the patience and the dedication to keep showing up, to doing the thing, to doing the craft with no direction until you find what it is that you found. But the thing with looking for the new, of not becoming obsessed with the past, of trying to create new things, is it can take time, right? Like we talked about how it's this process of elimination of you're kind of just going from one thing, that's not right, trying something else, that's not it either. Finally, you try something. Oh, this is more what it's supposed to feel like. Let's keep playing with this thing. Like that takes time, right? It's a lot of just being there in the process, beating your head against a wall. That's not it. Like you can see like a very foggy version of what this is in your head, but you just can't get it out of your head into the world. Like you don't quite know how to do that. And again, that's a very time-consuming process, right? Like I've spent hours of my life staring at the blinking cursor, trying a sentence, deleting it, trying another way, deleting it, getting a whole paragraph, realizing that's not what I'm trying to say, deleting it. Like it is a time-consuming process that requires patience. And when you're in that process of trying to express this thing in your brain in a way that you don't even necessarily know if people will respond to, the thoughts will creep in of like, hey, you don't have to do this. You could just do the thing in a way that people will respond to. You know, you don't have to, in Joni's case, you don't have to make a jazz record, Joni. You could just make something. And I guess this isn't even really voices in her head. This is more like her management being like, hey, you don't have to go make another jazz record. You could just give us another folk rock album and people are going to eat it up. It's going to sell a lot. You'll make a lot of money. But for Joni, that was never the point, right? Like she describes herself as like almost anti-commercial. She says, I don't even know how to sell out. If I tried to sell out, I don't think I could. But that I mean to make an attempt to make a commercial record. I just make them and I think, if I was a kid, I would like this song. You have to have a certain grabability initially and then something that wears well for years to come. That's what everything fine is. It's recognized in painting, but I'm just working in a toss-away industry. I'm a fine artist working in a commercial arena. So that's my cross to bear. And there's a few things in this quote that I kind of want to pull out and talk about. The first one is I want to clarify what she's saying. You have to have a certain grabability initially and then something that wears well. What she's saying here is that when you make something, it has to be interesting in the current moment, right? Like in order for something to stand the test of time, it has to have a little bit of traction in the beginning, because if it's something that no one's interested in the moment, it just gets forgotten about and there's like no one there to kind of bring it back around in the future. So it has to be interesting initially in some way, but then something that wears well means it has to get better with age. It has to stand the test of time. Now, of course, we'll talk about this later, but like you can't just make something like this one's going to stand the test of time, this one's not. Like in order to pass the test of time, you need time. Time is a factor. She also talks about how this approach of trying to make something that gets better the more you listen to it, the longer you listen to it, is very much like a painting thing, because you could stare. There's a professor, I think at Harvard, who one of the assignments she gives her students is you have to go to, I think it's the Met, Metropolitan Art Gallery, or an art gallery in New York. And you have to pick one painting that kind of stands out to you. Then you have to sit in front of that painting for 3 hours and just look at that one painting. Because the longer you look at a painting, the more that you should see. And that is what Joni's, I guess it's not even really the test of time. That was me misinterpreting it now that I'm talking. What she's really saying here is the more you listen to her music, the more you should get out of it. And what this bar professor is getting her students to do is to stare at one painting for so long, because the longer you stare, the more little things you're going to notice. And so that's what Joni wants you to have when you listen to her music, is she wants it to be this thing that, whether it stands the test of time or not, is not her objective. That's great, but you can't control that. What she's saying here is she wants you to get more out of her art the more time you put into it. And that's something that George Miller echoes. He does it in film. He wants the more times you watch his films, the more things you're going to pick up and notice. You know, Orson Welles, the director of Citizen Kane, he says that a movie should be better the second time you watch it, because there should be more things that the audience is able to pick up that they didn't pick up the first time. And that is what Joni is trying to do with her music. That is part of the reason why she is spending time focused on every single word in every single song. Not only so her work is transmissible, right? So it has that certain grabability in the beginning, but so that the words and the meaning of the words changes the more you listen to her songs. And she struggles with that because, right, this is very much like a painter's way of thinking, which again, Joni was a painter first, that she'd use music as a toss-away industry. And toss away from the fact of like, not everyone is putting in this amount of effort into their songs. They're relying on craft to just get their work out there, to rise on the charts, to do what works commercially, to make a lot of money. They're not as worried about what it is they are trying to communicate. But the thing is, most of those artists are not artists we're going to want to cover on Artwell because they aren't considered the greats like Joni Mitchell. And part of her concern with commercial work is she refers to it as like watering down. She doesn't want to water down what it is she's making. And I think that that's a tough line to walk, because you might make the most beautiful art in the world, but if nobody listens to it, if nobody watches it, is it the most beautiful art in the world if no one's seen it? And so I think the audience is something you should definitely factor in to your work. How can you present these ideas in a way that the audience is actually receptive to? And there's no easy way to do this calculation. It definitely should not be 100% audience. But then if it's 100% artist, the audience probably isn't going to see it. And so part of that too is just an internal conversation you need to have with yourself of like, what do I care about? And more often than not, if you're making art and you're putting it into the world, you're doing so with the expectation that people will see it. So you have to consider the audience when you're making something. Now, how much of the audience impacting your art is considered watered down? Again, that's a conversation I think you have to have with yourself. I can't give you a straight answer, but it's something you need to think about. when it comes to why am I making this thing? Because I think it's a spectrum, right? I think it's like you have the fully commercial people who are just making the thing to become famous and be seen. You have the artists who are trying to express this thing that's inside of them. But there's probably somewhere in the middle where both of them want to be, where the artist has an audience and the commercial artist is actually able to express something that they actually want to express. And so for you, you just have to figure out where on that spectrum you want to lie. And I think that this is something that Joni struggled with throughout her career. To be completely honest, this is my reading of it, is the fact that like you listen to interviews, she gets quite frustrated with the industry and the fact that people weren't as interested in her jazz music as her other records. And I think that, again, she definitely falls pretty much right at the end of the spectrum where she's like fully artist. And so she herself says she couldn't make a commercial record if she tried. And so because of that, people didn't really want to listen to some of her stuff. And again, I'm not one to say, well, Joni Mitchell should have made her albums differently, but it's just, again, it's a spectrum and you have to figure out what your comfort level is with people not listening and not making exactly what it is you want to make in order to get your work out there. But I say all of that, and Blue is considered one of the greatest albums of all time. It charted at number 1 on iTunes 50 years after its release. And that was an album made purely by Joni Mitchell expressing exactly what she wanted to say. So you also have to consider, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, I guess. But Joni, truthfully, like she is somebody who walked the walk. Like she talked about this, I don't do it for the money. I'm not in it. Like she basically says, I want to make enough money to continue making whatever the hell I want to make. It was essentially her mindset when it came to money. But when it comes to not being commercial, like she truly walked the walk. Like she was offered $1 million to perform in Las Vegas for a single night. And this was like back when like $1 million was truly like, holy shit, you made $1 million. Not to say that $1 million today is not a lot of money. It is. But like if you're talking $1 million in the 80s, that's a lot of money. And she turned it down. $1 million for like 2 hours of work. And she wouldn't do it because she said when it came to performing in Vegas, it was the kiss of death for serious music. And she didn't want to do that. And the thing with Joni Mitchell is like, yes, she has some really strong opinions, but she's able to back them up with her actions. Joni Mitchell is not just a talker. She is a walker. When it comes to commercial music, right? Because Joni, part of her original quote too, where she's talking about how she can't sell out, she says it's my cross to bear. And what she's saying with that one is, again, she doesn't judge people for making commercial music. Her cross to bear is the fact like she just has this mentality of being a fine artist in what she describes as a toss-away industry. So that's what you want to make that thing. Again, it's a conversation you have to have with yourself. You have to have the awareness to know what you want to make and how you want to make it. But all that being said, does commercial art need to be taken seriously, right? Like if we're having a conversation here around great art, do we need to talk about commercial art? Yes. Yes, we do. And in the way Joni puts it, is most of today's serious musicians aren't going into classical music. They're getting into the popular recording industry. So I think it has to be taken seriously. And I originally had that in there as just an interesting idea of like, oh yeah, like the great artists are making popular music. And I would even argue today now, like the true great artists are probably not even making like the most popular music anymore. Like one of the greatest guitarists of this current generation is this guitarist named McGee. He's made some good stuff, but he's not like a chart-topping musician in any way. So I think that when she said this, that was true. I think that's probably changing a little bit, where like the serious musicians are on the outside of the popular industry now. But the point I was going to make is, does commercial art need to be taken seriously? Yes, because I still think that truly great art has a way of both communicating something profound and reaching a lot of people. Like that point I made where it's like, is it great if nobody watches it? I'm not necessarily the judge of that. Holistically, I'm not the judge of that. I think internally, for me personally, I think that has to be a factor, right? Like Jurassic Park, phenomenal film. A lot of people watched it. The Lord of the Rings, incredible book series. A lot of people have read it. I have not. I may be reading it very soon. Read into that what you will. But I do think commercial art needs to be taken seriously. Like, you can't, as an artist, put your nose up at something because it is popular. Because again, most artists are making things with the intention of people seeing them. And so, of course, you have to take it seriously. And again, Joni can say this, but she also will then say you have two options as an artist. You can stay the same. And this is more so around her evolution as an artist, and the fact that some of her evolutions did not work as well as she probably hoped, specifically going into the jazz stuff, which should have been expected, because jazz records, even though she says like she doesn't make jazz music, she just makes music and it has some jazz flavor. Like, even so, however you want to talk about it, jazz records do not sell super high. So I think it's not a surprise that her, whether you want to call them jazz records or her jazz flavored records, like, it's no surprising that they didn't sell very well because of what a typical jazz record sells like. But for her, it's just, but she's going through this period, and in the bio I said like raging against the machine of the 80s. That's kind of how it felt like, where she was very, very frustrated, and it came across in the interviews when I was reading them. And one of these quotes is, you can stay the same and protect the formula that gave you your initial success. They're going to crucify you for staying the same. If you change, they're going to crucify you for changing. But staying the same is boring, and change is interesting. So of the two options, I'd rather be crucified for changing. And I think that there's, again, a level of validity to that, right? Like when I talk about a lot of her interviews, she seems quite frustrated in them. A lot of it is warranted. But I also think that, again, like I talked about, the genre she chose is into a smaller sized audience, which is obviously not her existing one. And so that was to be expected. I think the idea of, I don't necessarily think that people are going to be upset at you for changing. I mean, I say that quite broadly, but obviously when you make changes, a certain percentage of people aren't going to like it and a certain percentage of people are going to like it. And I think there are ways to reinvent yourself as an artist in a way that people are going to be receptive to. Two examples we've talked about on this show: Robin Williams. He went from like this zany comedian to like a serious stand-up comedian or like a popular stand-up comedian to a serious Oscar-winning actor. Like, he was always reinventing himself, and it was working. It took time for it to work, but he also made these jumps that were not necessarily so far. Like, he wasn't going to completely different things. Like, a comedian to a serious role is, especially at the time, I feel like, was quite a jump. But he made that jump. And it took some time, obviously, but it worked. God of War is another example, right? Like, they were doing the same thing. Eventually people were bored of the same thing. So they completely reinvented the franchise. It is a completely different game from what it used to be. And it was just as good, if not better, depending on who you ask. And so this idea that you're going to be crucified no matter what, I mean, I think yes, but that could be by the minority. I think in Joni's case, she was just struggling because her changes weren't working. And so I hear what she's saying, but I also think that change is a natural part of being an artist. I don't think that people are necessarily going to crucify you if you change. They're going to if your change does not work properly. And this, again, I want to be abundantly clear. This is not me saying that Joni Mitchell made bad music in the late 70s into the 80s. I'm just saying she made music that her audience wasn't open to. And that's okay. If like she had been like, I'm going to go into the jazz world, but then again, she had problems because the jazz world didn't accept her, but her old audience didn't like that she was going jazz. And so she kind of, again, she was right. All of her opinions are from her own lived experience. So I'm not trying to invalidate those, but I just don't necessarily know if I agree with the idea that you're going to be crucified for changing. I think you can make change if you make those changes. Again, this gets, part of the thing is Joni Mitchell is pure artist. And you can make changes if you're going to evolve, make an evolution into a lane that your existing audience would be interested in. I think when she made such a big jump from what she was making before to jazz music, like that was a big jump where there was kind of this, like, her audience wasn't going to follow her there. Robin Williams people were going to follow him to movies. They were interested to see how he was going to do the serious roles. And God of War, people were interested in a more mature video games were popular, and people were going to be interested in that. But people weren't necessarily going to be interested in Joni Mitchell making a jazz record. And so I do hear what she's saying, where you can absolutely be crucified for staying the same, and you can be crucified for changing, but I don't think that those are the only two outcomes. I do think that there is a way to make a change, to evolve as an artist in a way that goes well. And I would even argue that you have to change as an artist, because I completely agree with you that you will get crucified or people will just stop paying attention if you just keep doing the same thing. So change is necessary, but how you make that change is a skill and a difficult thing to do. And I think Joni's jazz stuff is being more, has a better response now. But even if you look at her Spotify, and again, I know this isn't a perfect way of looking at it, especially when a lot of her older fans are probably not listening on Spotify. They're listening on CDs and vinyls. But like using Spotify as a proxy, like all of her popular stuff is still her early stuff. And so I think that, again, she alienated a lot of her audience doing that. That is not me saying that she made bad music by any stretch. Her jazz records are fantastic. Jaco Pastorius playing bass on it, they're great. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the most popular. And those two things can exist, where she made great work, but it didn't work for her audience expectations. And she made a valid point too, of like, if she'd done them in reverse order, if she'd made her jazz stuff first, maybe they would have been more popular. We'll never know. But all this is a long tangent to say of like, I do agree that if you just do the same thing for too long, like people will get bored of you 100%. That is why Robin Williams was very intentionally making changes throughout his career, and Joni Mitchell was doing the same thing. I don't agree that you're going to be crucified either way. Obviously, yes, there'll probably be a little bit of I'm thinking about this one in real time. That's why this is such a long tangent, because I'm trying to figure out exactly how I think about this. But I think that initially, maybe she is right. Maybe you will get crucified either way. And of course, change is interesting. Actually, here's how I'm going to interpret this. You will get crucified absolutely if you stay the same. You will get crucified if you make a change. Yes, staying the same is boring. Change is interesting. So of course, continually change as an artist. However, where my opinion is starting to click in here now, you will get crucified for changing, but you have the potential of earning your audiences, of winning the audience over with a change you won't by staying the same. Right? So if we look at, let's use God of War as the example. God of War makes this change from this like hack and slash game to a more over the shoulder action adventure game. And the audience at first was like, what is this? This is not what we wanted. This isn't God of War. This is something else. Da, 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 da. But then they get the game in their hands and they play it and they go, oh, I get it. This is incredible. And so when you first make the change, people are not going to understand it. And you just have to ride that out with the expectation if you're going to make something that's going to win them back. We're going to move on because I'm just going to keep going around in circles on this one. But really the kind of like the punchline of it is that like it takes time for new work to be accepted. And Joni also understood that, right? Like, so she's a human being with nuanced opinions, evolving opinions. And so while she will say you're either going to get crucified either way, she also has the understanding of like to know there's a sensitivity lag. Some statements that are made by artists in their desire to look at the world in a fresh way have traditionally come up against a shocking reception. When Stravinsky first played, people jumped out of their seats and booed and hissed. People were infuriated by even less dramatic changes, like Dylan going electric. And really, I guess what happens is when you evolve as a musician, when you try to push, or as an artist, when you try to push the culture forward, what happens is you're pushing people out of their comfort zone. People don't want to leave their comfort zone. It's necessary and important, and that's part of your responsibility as an artist, is to push the culture forward. But again, when doing so, when you push people out of their comfort zones, they're going to push back at you until eventually that little bit out of their comfort zone that you pushed them becomes normal, and it becomes their comfort zone. And then they're going to accept what it is that you've made. And so I guess that's where like the initial crucifixion, where the audience is originally going to be upset with you when you make a change, is because that's not their comfort zone. That's not what they're expecting. But they will become used to it. And when they're used to it, then they're going to be more open to it. And so I guess when you look at the example of Joni Mitchell versus God of War, is like God of War's audience went with it when it made the change. And it was like, I'm going to stay here. And this became its comfort zone. Joni Mitchell's audience didn't stick with her when she went to jazz. Like they'd listen, they're like, this isn't for me. And they went back to their comfort zone. She wasn't able to keep them outside of their comfort zone long enough for it to become normal, if that makes sense. But that's the thing, is like, it's going to take time for things to be accepted because it has to become normal for your audience. And again, like we talked about too, Blue, even in the beginning, right, it had a mixed response from people. Like I said, Rolling Stone wasn't really nice to it critically. And then 50 years later, or not quite 50 years later, they name it as their third greatest album of all time. Like you can't pass the test of time in the moment, right? And so Joni is always evolving, and like some of her stuff now is more better received today, 40, 50 years after it was released than when it was initially released. But for her, she couldn't help but change her style, right? Because she was just, as she was changing as a human being, her music was changing. Of course, she had a lot of frustration in her evolution as an artist because people were always trying to just get her to go back. And she said, all people have to do, if they want me to go back, is go back and play the old records. I already did that. And it reminds me very much of this interview that the singer John Bellion gave when he released his second studio album, Glory Sound Prep. So with his first studio album, which was The Human Condition, he had this song that exploded called All Time Low. And he said that he was really frustrated when people listened to Glory Sound Prep. They didn't like it because they just wanted to hear All Time Low again. And he's like, if you want to hear me go low, 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 low again, just go listen to All Time Low again. Like, I'm not going to do the same thing. That's not exciting for me as an artist. And in that same interview, he talks about the fact of like, we don't know how this album's actually going to be received, which I think is a really interesting idea of like, how an album is initially received in the moment is not actually how the album is received, because you need time in order to know what it is that you've made. And one time Seal called up Joni Mitchell and he goes, come over, I've written a standard. And a standard is essentially just like a classic song that's going to live on forever. And Joni was like, you can't write a standard. You write a song, and if it's good and people like it, if you get 300 or 400 covers of it, you've written a standard. You can't write it and predict that everyone will want to cover it. You can't tell if something is going to stand the test of time in the moment. You need time. And like I said, with Joni, there's like this growing appreciation of her work now. People are coming around to go, oh, wow, her jazz period was actually, wow, it was really good. I just didn't listen in the moment, but I'm listening now and it's really good. And wow, Jaco Pastorius' bass on Joni's stuff is so good. Clearly you can type in listening to some Jaco Pastorius as well, because I've mentioned him a couple times. But wow. And now look at the bands Joni had on her jazz albums. She has some of the greats all working on one album. This is incredible. It's like in the moment. Again, you just need time sometimes for people to appreciate it. And that's the challenging thing when you're trying to evolve in the way that Joni Mitchell did. I think it's an admirable thing that she was doing that she was evolving. And again, she wasn't doing it for the sake of evolving. She was doing it because that is what she wanted to express and how she wanted to express it. And the important thing here too is that I think part of like, I talk about Joni being frustrated at the response to it. And I don't want to be that come across as a negative thing, because I think the reason that Joni was so frustrated with the response to her albums in the same way that John Bellion was with Glory Sound Prep, and think in both of those cases, the reason those two artists were frustrated was because they were proud of what they'd made. You know what I mean? Like, even if other people don't like it, you have to make sure you do. And that's the thing with making a commercial record. You're not as invested in it emotionally. And so it's like, if you don't like your record, why are other people going to like it? And so for Joni, it's like when people would critically pan her record, she would be frustrated, rightfully so, because she's put so much into it, and they listen to it like 2 times and give it a critical and give it some review. And then she even talks about how like you have reviewers who write their reviews based off of other reviewers. And once the lead reviewer comes out and doesn't really like your album, everyone just kind of falls in line. And so again, a lot of warranted frustration, but a lot of that also came from the fact that she was proud of what she made. She put everything she had into these records. I like to work myself up to a state of enthusiasm about anything I do. Otherwise, what's the point? I see a lot of people and say, hey, you got an album coming out. What's it like? They say, oh, it's okay. And I bet you those people were making commercial albums. I say, gee, you're putting an album out and you think it's okay? Where's your enthusiasm, man? They don't like to hear that. I'm not talking about arrogance, but I believe in real enthusiasm. And I think that that is so critical, is like, you have to be proud of what it is that you've made, because if you're not, why is anybody else going to? And when you're proud of that thing, you're going to want to put it out into the world. And part of that too is like when you put it out into the world and you're so proud, when people don't like it, you're naturally going to get defensive. But you still need to put it out there. You've got to be enthusiastic, as Joni talks about, because why would you make anything if you're not? Right? Like, I think you have to remember, like, your art lasts a long time. And so why would you put anything out that you're not excited about? Be proud of the shit that you made. I told you I was going to talk about him again, and here he is, Tyler, the Creator, once again. I was talking about how, like, he'll see people who will make a song and they'll put up one Instagram story about it. And that's it. He'll be like, you mean to tell me you wrote the words, you made the beat, you picked out a beat, you recorded the song, you paid for studio time, you put the song out, and all you're going to do is put up one Instagram story? He was like, I put out an album almost a year ago and I'm still out here telling people about it because I'm so proud of it. And that is the feeling you want whenever you put anything out as an artist. That's how Joni felt about her records. That's how Tyler felt about his, feels about his. You know, I even think about, this is so important, especially for like when you run into obstacles in the creative process. Like if you're enthusiastic, like you're going to hit those obstacles and you're going to keep going because you just love this thing so much and you want to see it out there. When you're not as enthusiastic, you're going to run into obstacles and you're going to be like, I don't want to deal with this. And so I think it's so important, and it's a bit of an unlock for me because I've been trying to get back to writing screenplays. I'm like 20 pages into a screenplay and I realize I'm like not enthusiastic about this story. Like it's kind of like whatever, and I'm just kind of doing it out of routine. I think it's because I'm not enthusiastic about it. Like I've hit some obstacles. I'm like, I don't really care enough to go back to it. Like my schedule is busy. I said, new full-time job. I'm doing this show, which takes a lot of time. I'm prioritizing time with my fiance. There's not really much time to write. But if I was really excited and enthusiastic about the screenplay I was working on, I would find the time. If I had 10 minutes, I would work on it if I was excited. But instead, like, I just don't think it is, and that's a real big unlock for me. Is enthusiasm about what you're making is one of the most important things you can have. And of course, enthusiasm is important because, again, the reason we're doing this, you and I, the reason we're making things should be for the thing itself, not for the outcome. And if that is the case, if we're making things for the act of making the thing itself, then it should be fun to do. Because in other words, why are you doing it? And so for Joni, she said, my goal has been to constantly remain interested in music. I see myself as a musical student. And she remained interested in music throughout her entire career. And she was able to do that by stretching and pushing herself into new areas, into different forms. She was always exploring with her music. She treated her music as an adventure, as you should too. And again, she was never changing for the sake of change. She was changing because she was changing as a human being, and she was getting better as a musician and finding new ways to express how she felt. And expressing how you feel, again, is one of the most important things you can do as an artist. Communicate your emotions truthfully. Joni had this really interesting idea when it came to singing. She broke it down to like 3 elements: perfect time, perfect pitch, perfect color. And color being like the emotion that you're putting onto the words. And she said that you can't have all 3 of those things in your performance. You can really only have 1, maybe 2, but really, for the most part, you can only have 1. And if you give her pick of perfect time, perfect color, perfect pitch, she said she would always choose perfect color, the emotion she's putting into the words. And perfect color, actually, I'm going to read you her quote and then I'm going to tell you what perfect color really means. She says she likes to do that because she likes the text. And Bob Dylan does that. He never reads the same thing the same 2 days in a row. And when she says reads, she means performs. And as a result, you can almost see his state of mind in the reading. And I respect that. I think that's emotional honesty. And so when she's talking about perfect color, what perfect color means is a honest delivery of the words based off of how you are feeling in that moment. And I think too, this actually reminds me something now of, we talked about with the Keith Jarrett episode, is Keith would force spontaneity out of his band. And the way he would do that is he would hide their music stands and he would only do one take. And he likes to, there was this quote from this composer from the 1900s, I can't remember his name, but he had this quote that Keith loved, which was essentially like, if I did a second take, I could have done it better, but it wouldn't have been as good. Like it could have had, in this context of Joni, it could have had perfect pitch, it could have had perfect time, but there would have been more intellectual. So the coloring of the music wouldn't have been as accurate to how I'm actually feeling. And so for Joni, that is one of the most important things, is to have perfect color, to match your work to how you're feeling, to have emotional honesty. Because the thing about the emotional honesty is, if you are true about your experience, it is going to be applicable, right? Because there's this fear when it comes to making art that if you focus too much on your individual experience, that it's going to alienate everybody else who could possibly consume your work. But actually, your life and your experiences, while they are unique to you, the emotions you experience going through your life are universal. So your life and your experiences make your art vivid and true, like there's emotional honesty there, but those emotions are what is universal. So Joni says her goal is to be subjective, but hopefully universal. That was always my optimism, that if I described my own changes through whatever the decade was throwing at us, that there were others like me. And it turns out that there were. So another way of looking at this is, like I talked about earlier, John Colley, the screenwriter, how when he had to write a screenplay about someone who climbed a mountain, like climbed an ice on the side of a mountain with like ice picks, he went out and did that himself so that he could reflect it in his screenplay authentically. And when I say authentically, what I mean is the way in which he describes it, so that it's translated onto screen. It's not so that other people who have done that are like, oh yes, that's authentic, that's how it's done. But it's to be able to properly communicate and show the stress that you experience when you do that in the text and then on the screen, so that people sitting in their seats who have never ice picked before, whatever it's called, can relate to the stress of that moment. Like it feels so real and true that they can put themselves in the screen. They can understand what the character is going through, because they can relate the stress that they're having to a stress they've experienced in their own life. You want your art to be subjective. You want your experience to make your art feel real, but the feelings that you're putting into it are what is going to make it universal to everyone. And that is why focusing on your life as an artist and pulling your life into your work is so important. Because when you focus on the audience, right, like when you write things from trying to relate to the audience's perspective, is it doesn't really lead to sincerity. And like the audience, people relate to people, right? And so if you write in a one-to-one setting, you're going to be able to better relate to people than if you are writing for the masses. And I think all of this really demonstrates that like Joni Mitchell took her work incredibly seriously. Like very similar to Keith Jarrett, was like the music above all else. Joni Mitchell was very much the same. Like there's this documentary from 2003 about her life, and she talks in that documentary about how she was very much in love with the singer Graham Nash. And he proposed, and initially I believe she said yes. She wanted to get married, so they were engaged. But she had this realization of, if she got married, it would force her to prioritize her marriage and not prioritize her music. And she couldn't do that. And she talked about her grandmothers on both sides were artists that never got the chance to explore their artistry. And she was given that chance, and she didn't want to squander this gift that she had. She said she wanted to, honor her grandmothers. But I think there's also just a level of like, this is innate to who she is. She would not be alive if she was prioritizing something over her music. And so she said she ultimately made the decision to leave Graham Nash and to break off their engagement if they were engaged or they were talking about getting married. She broke off their relationship. Yes, here, she said that leaving him was incredibly hard to do. She'd initially said yes to marry him because she loved him and she wanted to get married. But the music came first, and she viewed this marriage as something that would get in the way of her music. I think this shows her commitment to the music. Like, she was more committed to the music than anything else, which is interesting because she did ultimately get married in the 80s again. But at this point in time, she felt her music was too important. And I also bring this up actually because I have this like interesting theory I wanted to talk about when it comes to Joni Mitchell and her music and her muse and her love. Is Larry Klein, who was Joni's second husband, so the guy she ultimately did end up marrying, said that, and he was also a fellow musician, he worked on a lot of Joni's records, and he's saying that love is very important. Yes, to Joni, but to Joni's muse. And so in my notes, I wrote, interesting. I wonder if she knew this, in particular when it came to leaving Graham Nash. And when the romance would run dry, or like the excitement of it, the things that would give her things to write about would run dry, she would have to leave to reinvigorate her muse. And she has said she would prioritize her art over love with Graham Nash. And so if she wasn't able to get, if the relationship was no longer invigorating her muse, would she leave, whether consciously or subconsciously, I guess, to reinvigorate her muse? Because not only could Joni write about love, she could also write really, really well about heartbreak. And so I'm not necessarily implying that this is something she was doing strategically, but more so, I guess, a subconscious thing that she was doing. And even a quote of hers, I think this is from the documentary. You're doing a tightrope walk to keep your heart alive, to keep your art alive, to keep it vital and useful to others. And I think that line of this tightrope walk of keeping your heart alive and keeping your art alive is what I'm kind of getting at here. Is like she knew that there were sacrifices she had to make in her love life that would, in order to keep her, not only to keep her art alive, but potentially to even give her art some life. And I don't really have a coherent point here, but that is just something I wanted to kind of float out here because I wrote that down on my notes. That really stood out to me when I was watching the documentary. And there's a good chance that they maybe structured the documentary in that way intentionally, but that was something that stood out to me. But even though Joni was pulling all of her material from her life, from her relationships, we talked about already how it's like subjective but universal. Not only is it universal, but it's also open to interpretation strategically. And we've talked about this in Artwell from could be season or the James Cameron deep dive. Maybe not, maybe a little later. But this is something that actually truly I've been thinking about since I studied Freddie Mercury before Artwell even existed, was Freddie, and again, we've talked about this, probably could be all the way back to the first episode on Salvador Dali, but we've talked about art being open to interpretation, being important to art's connection with the world, because when your art is open to interpretation, people are able to apply their own meaning to it, which deepens their connection with it, versus if you tell them what your music is about, then you've invalidated everyone's connection because how they viewed the song is now wrong. And so a lot of these great artists, Freddie Mercury with Queen, Joni Mitchell does it. We talked about a lot with George Miller, how he tries to make his stories allegorical, which essentially just means open to interpretation, so that people can find things in them that you didn't even intend to put in there. And Joni did the exact same thing. She said, after a song's been written, it becomes a whole different thing. You don't own it anymore, which is, again, another thing we've talked about. Once you put your art out into the world, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the world to do with and interpret however they choose. And even truthfully, if you want to get down into the weeds of it, like your interpretation of your art is your interpretation. It is not true. It is your subjective opinion once your art is out into the world. You can intentionally put those things in there, but that doesn't mean somebody is going to necessarily pick up on those things. They're going to find things in your work that you didn't even mean for them to be there. And Joni even talks about how she will even sing a song that she sang or that she wrote years ago, and how she will interpret it will be different based off of where she's at in her life at that point in time when she's singing it on stage. She said, anytime I have a passionate new relationship, that song will come to life in a new way. If it's overly explained, you rob the people whose lives it brushes up against of their own interpretation and their own experience. I know how a song falls differently against your life many times. To keep it alive, you're bringing new experience to it all the time. And it's not the experience you wrote it with, so it's open to interpretation. So there she's talking about these two things of how like it's open to interpretation for the audience, but it's also open to interpretation for her when she revisits this song. And for her, when she's performing it again, right, she's bringing this new experience to the song, which is important for her to do because, again, she's talking about how important emotional honesty is when she's performing. And so for her, she has to bring her new experiences to old music, which slightly changes their interpretation, but that's important to her because it would be inauthentic to try and sing that song in a way that is not a representation of how she feels right now. And I actually think that this quote ties back into a couple of things that we've been talking about over the course of this deep dive so far. I think it ties into this idea of Joni's life influencing her work, and even a little bit of like this idea of like how she values her music over love and how she lets love kind of intentionally influence her music, with the quote at the beginning where she says like, anytime I have a passionate new relationship, it brings new life to the song. So it's showing how she's bringing her life, how her life is giving life to her art. It's also talking about authentically conveying emotions, like communicating emotion with intentionality. You know, she talks about the color of the words, and she's coloring the words when she's singing them based off of how she feels in that moment in order to be authentic. But then it's also talking about how her art is open to interpretation, how her music is something that she treats as a fine art the same way a painter does. And of course, Joni Mitchell is a painter herself. And no matter how famous she became, painting never left her. She never stopped painting. You could argue painting was her first love. Before she was ever a singer or a songwriter, Joni had a brush in her hand. And what's interesting about that is this is a theme that's starting to emerge of these talented artists in other domains who started as painters or by drawing. You know, some of the examples Joni mentioned over the course of the research was John Lennon, obviously the Beatles, Pete Townsend, Jeff Beck. These are all musicians. But from a directorial context, if we look at the two directors we've studied film directors, I should say, we've studied on Artwell so far, being James Cameron and George Miller, both of them were also artists, painters, drawers when they were growing up. And Ridley Scott, the director of the original Alien and Blade Runner, he was also a painter when he was growing up. I don't necessarily have a through line amongst this. I think this is just an interesting trend that I'm starting to notice. I don't know enough about painting in order to be able to say why this is beneficial for artists, but Joni does have an idea of sorts. She says that painting helps you hold on to your inner child. To quote her, she thinks that painters live so long because they're juveniles at heart. They never put their crayons away. And there's something to that, to this holding on to your inner child. We're probably going to end with a longer tangent around the idea of your inner child, but I do think that that is important as an artist because you need to look at the world with this awe and wonder. And the people who look at the world with a sense of awe and wonder is children. And the longer you can hold on to that, the more you can foster that with yourself, the better it was going to benefit you. But a more concrete example of how painting helped Joni as an artist. And again, a reminder, she was born in Calgary, raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which if you're not Canadian is a relatively, it's a city relatively, but it's a farming town for sure. Saskatchewan as a whole is just a farming province. That is their industry. So Joni grew up around a lot of farmers. And she says what painting allows her to do is to rotate her crops. And it's this farming technique, but essentially how Joni would use crop rotation with her art is she would do her music, and then when her time with her music was done, she would rotate and she would do her painting. And then she would rotate back to music, and then she would rotate back to painting. And then that way, nothing ever really got boring for her. She was always coming to it with fresh eyes, fresh perspective, new energy. And additionally, It also, according to her, allowed her to clear her head. That the process of painting and the process of making a song were two very different things. Like we've talked about, for her, writing a song was very much like going inside, doing a lot of internal work to understand who she is, what she's gone through, versus painting for her is more meditative. It's more of a way to clear her head. So she would go deep inside herself in order to write her music. She would need some time to kind of like recharge and refresh, and painting would allow her to do that. So she would crop rotate between painting and music throughout her entire life. And in addition to that, of like having two different processes for doing the art, whether it be singing or painting, she also says that painting allowed her to have a different expression when it came to getting things out. She said, I sing my sorrow and I paint my joy, which I thought is really, really interesting, because she, of course, went on to have more joyful songs at different points in her career, but sorrow is definitely like a consistent theme throughout her music. And so by having two different artistic outputs, two different forms of expression, it allows you to access different parts of you that the other medium doesn't allow. This is why I think it's important for you to have multiple artistic pursuits, not only because it allows you to kind of crop rotate to go from one to the other. It's also going to give you ideas. Like, I'm sure her painting gives her some ideas that she can bring into her music, and her music gives her ideas that she can bring into her painting. But the thing is that you can't pursue both of these things fully. Right? Like, this is a lesson we talked about with James Cameron, who of course is one of the other artists, painters that became successful in a different field. Is he would talk about how if you want to be a director, you have to just focus on being a director. You can't have one foot in directing and one foot in cabinet making. You have to be all in on this thing, because that is what is required in order to be great. You need this focus, because so many people want to do this thing, and that if you truly want to be the best, you can't have outside distractions. That doesn't mean it's the only thing you do. And what that means, essentially, if you want to be great, and focus in this context is like, this is the thing I'm trying to make it with, right? Like, you can't be trying to make it as a painter and as a director or as a musician. And with James and with Joni, what is interesting is they have their pursuit. They are trying to be successful as a singer, in Joni's case, as a director in James's. And painting, not only was it, in Joni's case, allowing for a different form of expression, but it wasn't necessarily something that she took seriously in the same way that she took singing. And so by having a different creative output, it allows for not only a freedom of expression, but a freedom of what you create, right? Because as much as Joni is an artist at heart, she's going to make what she feels she wants to make. She's going to make what she truly has to express and put in the world. That is then the performance, or how that is perceived, is dictated by its critical performance, right? She talked about being a fine artist playing in a commercial field. That is always going to weigh on her in some capacity. Painting never did, because she truly was only painting for herself. Her painting, she had a couple of galleries at certain points throughout her career, but that was far later, into like the late 80s, I believe, and once in the 2000s. But that was it. Like, she was never painting to make money. She was only ever painting for herself. And so because she was not ambitious with her painting, it allowed her to paint whatever she wanted. And her quote is, the beauty of not caring is that I can go back to that which I can enjoy. And so I think as you pursue whatever it is you're trying to pursue, whatever your primary artistic field is, whenever money does become involved, it is going to change your relationship with it, whether you want it to or not, right? Even your perception of how good a piece of art is going to be dictated by the amount of money it generates, whether consciously or subconsciously, right? And it's even harder to avoid that in today's world, where everything has a metric attached to it. You post anything anywhere on the internet, you can see the likes, you can see the views, you can see the comments. You're always analyzing things. The performance of, you're putting the value of your art purely in a number. And again, that's a factor, of course, if you're trying to get your art into the world for people to see, that matters. But there's also something that you can't really see when you're just looking at numbers, and that's impact. But that's besides the point. The point I'm trying to make here is the fact that painting was something Joni just did purely for the act of painting. And it allowed her to recharge. It allowed her to not give her something to do, a creative outlet that wasn't work, quote unquote. Not that singing was work, but you know what I'm saying? It was her job to be a singer. Painting was not her job. And so in my context, like using me as an example, the podcast has to be the main thing right now. This is the thing I'm focused at. This is what needs to be the thing that I put all of my time and energy into, when I'm not at my full-time job. The thing I want to crop rotate with is screenwriting. And writing is something I've just not been able to fully get back to. I want to more, but that's more something I can do for the fun and for the joy of it. It can be a hobby, essentially, right? And which is interesting because I feel like, and this is actually starting to come around more where people are actually having hobbies again. But I felt like from like 2017, 2018 to up until very recently, 24, 25, hobbies, and maybe this is just me projecting because this is how my brain works. People didn't really have hobbies. They had side hustles. We never did anything purely for the fun of doing the thing. It felt like it's like people were, and if you did have something like, if you had a rock climbing hobby, you turn that into like a content thing. And then you started making your rock climbing about posting on social media and getting views and becoming a rock climbing personal brand. Like we weren't able to do things just purely for the fun of it. And I think that if you're going to do this crop rotation technique where you have your main thing and you have the thing you do to recharge, the thing you do to recharge cannot be something you're expecting to make a lot of money with or to become famous with or to get followers with. It's just something for you to do to recharge. And I think that is not an equation, but that is something I have to kind of wrap my head around when it comes to my writing. Because I personally, and I don't know if you're like this, but I suck at hobbies. I suck at hobbies from the perspective of like, I can't just like do the hobby for fun casually. Like I take things 0 to 100 very quickly. And the problem that I'm having getting back into screenwriting is the fact that last time I was writing seriously, I was doing 3 hours a day, 90 minutes of writing, 90 minutes of learning, where I would like study screenwriting and watch videos about screenwriters and read scripts and try to get better. And you know what? Saying that, my progression as a screenwriter, I think was very quick because I was able to do that. And I think that if I can't get back into in that capacity while doing the show. And so because I'm not able to just have fun with the screenwriting, it becomes a very serious thing. And that's with any hobby that I do. And so I just need to get back to that, to be able to crop rotate in the same way that Joni Mitchell does, where you have your one thing that is, this is going to be the money maker, quote unquote. And then you have the other thing that is just for creative expression, the thing you can just keep for fun, which truthfully is going to allow you to create more freely. Even whether consciously or subconsciously money is involved, it is going to impact your process. And so really the takeaway here is like, you want to keep the passion pure, or in other words, keep the hobby healthy. And this is, again, what I hope the podcast will become. I want the podcast to be the serious thing that makes the money, that allows me to write freely. Like the podcast will be the thing that will cover my bills so that my art can remain pure. That is the ideal scenario. And that is a scenario that Joni Mitchell created for herself. When we view her as this singer, again, this is putting labels on her, right, of singer-songwriter versus painter. And she just uses the term artist broadly because it all kind of falls under one. But like for Joni Mitchell, she is a painter who used singing and songwriting as a way to pay her bills so she could spend her free time painting and not feel guilty about it. But with Joni's painting, one of the things that you get with painting is you get to control the entire process. You do it alone. Versus when it comes to music making, that process isn't one you necessarily do alone, right? You have other musicians who play music on your songs, you have producers, you have engineers. And so early in Joni's career, she said that she didn't want to work with other bands because, you know, music was very serious for her and she wanted it serious to remain, and she wanted to be playing with other people to be more fun, where she's not necessarily focused on her own imperfections and getting all the little details right. Like she wanted playing with other people to just be for fun. That was what she said as to why she didn't play with a band. But if you were to ask me, I think the real reason, or a big part of the reason, was the fact that growing up as a painter, she had full control. And the more people she put into her process as a musician, the less and less control she felt like she had. And so it got to the point where she stripped away every single person from the process. She had no other musicians on her records. She had no producer. She fired her producer and produced all of her own albums. I think from her second album forward, she never worked with a producer until her husband started getting producer credits. But like her first album was produced by David Crosby. Her second album was being produced by somebody who produced The Doors. And partway through their session, he's like, look, I got to go produce The Doors for 2 weeks. So we'll pick this back up when we get back, or when I get back. And he leaves. And so she goes to her engineer and she's like, hey, do you think we can produce this entire, or we can do this entire album ourselves in 2 weeks? Because if he comes back, he's going to make me hate the process and I'm not going to finish this. And the engineer was like, yeah, we could probably do that. And so they did the entire album in 2 weeks. And then she never had another producer outside of her husband after that. It was just her. She's producing all her own music because, again, that gave her the control. But eventually, as her career progressed, she kind of warmed up to the idea of playing with a band, and then she started to add more people to her records. Like I think her first album with a full band was Court Spark in 1974. And then from then on, she always had a full band, and she put together some really impressive bands, especially with her jazz records. Like she was putting together like the Avengers of jazz music and they played the music on her records. So she was assembling really interesting bands. But the reason that she decided to start working with bands, because she also figured out in her way like how to guide the process still and remain in control when adding additional collaborators. So she grew as a leader in that sense. But for her, as she progressed into the 70s and she thought more and more of playing with bands, the reason for that was because she felt that it would allow her, the way her voice was changing, it allowed her to approach the music differently and express things in a different way that she couldn't by herself. She said, I've got a voice I haven't used yet and haven't developed, which is very deep and strong, and it could carry over a loud band. And I'm very tempted to go in that direction experimentally. But rushing ahead of ideas is bad. An idea must grow at its own pace. If you push it and it's not ready, it'll just fall apart. And what I really want to focus on with this quote is kind of the second half of it, where she's talking about rushing ahead of ideas is a bad thing. And an idea must grow at its own pace. Because I think she's right. Like if you try to do something too early and you're not ready for that idea, the execution of it isn't going to go well. And the idea that you have in your head is not going to come to fruition the right way. And it's going to be a lost cause. Now, the flip side of that, though, is that you can use, I just want to give the idea time to develop, as a way to delay action. And so the only way you can really know if you're delaying it because the idea needs time to develop and you need time to develop, or if you're just afraid of taking the action, comes down to self-awareness. And I would say Joni Mitchell is self-aware enough to know which one of those two things is true for her. There's the question you need to ask yourself when it comes to an idea you have that you're not doing. Answer these questions in order, because I think you can trick yourself with the answer to the first one, and this is why the second one is important. The first question you need to ask is, am I not doing this idea because I don't have the skills yet in order to make that idea real? Which could be a very real thing, right? Like if you are somebody who has only ever worked on an indie movie, you might not have the skills yet to go and make like a $300 million blockbuster. That might be the reason, like not taking financial into the equation, but that just might just be a talent gap thing, right? This is, you even see like in terms of talent gap, you see this with touring musicians. An artist could have 40 million monthly streams on Spotify. They don't get the arena tour until they've done like the venue size right below. So in Toronto, we have our arena, which has like 20,000 seats. We also have like an amphitheater, which is like 9 to 13,000. And I've seen artists that are huge on Spotify go to the amphitheater, which when you'd think they'd be playing the arena, because they have to prove that they can draw people into that venue before going to the big one. And that also gives you time to develop as talent. So from like a touring context, you're never going to go from a small venue to a huge one right away. There has to be a level of development that's kind of built into this process so that by the time you get to the big venue, you know how to make the most of it. So the first question again, are you not doing this idea that you have because you haven't developed enough? You don't have the skill set to make the most of it, to realize this idea. Now, if you say, I don't have the skills for this idea, because if you say yes, then go ahead and do the idea. If you say, no, I don't have the skill set, the second question you got to ask yourself is, am I not doing this idea because I'm too afraid to try it? And if the answer is yes, then I think you're lying to yourself with the first question. Because the truth of the matter is, like, you're never actually going to have the full skill set in order to make this idea, if it's something you're stretching for as a creative, you're never going to have the full skill set to do that thing until you've actually done it. So there's a level of like, how wide is the skill gap, right? And so with the first question, you're being honest about how wide the skill gap is. The first question is going to basically show you that the skill gap exists. But the second question is going to show you how wide the skill gap actually is. And if you're lying to yourself about how wide it is, if it's more narrow than you think, and you're just afraid of trying the idea, then you need to go for it anyways, because that is how you are going to grow as an artist. And Joni, again, of course, had the self-awareness in order to know that it was not quite time in like the early 70s to perform with a band, but by the mid 70s, it was definitely time for her to do so. And one thing she was really good at was finding good collaborators. Like, even from an engineering perspective or a producing perspective, like she worked with David Crosby to produce her first record, because she said he is the most into my music of any outsider I've ever met. So she found someone who believed in her and her music, and that made a great collaborator. She never worked with another producer after David Crosby until she got married much later in her career, because one, we talked about, like, there was just the lack of control. And so Henry Louis, her engineer, was somebody else she worked with, and he was great. He was a great collaborator. She found all of these different, again, she assembled these bands that were like the Avengers of jazz music for her bands later in her career. Like, she was able to find good collaborators. And how could she do that? Like, what was she looking for in these people that would allow her to, that she knew that they would make good collaborators? Because she was picky with who she worked with, because she didn't want them. The biggest thing for Joni, I think, was she didn't want her collaborators to influence her process, right? Like we talked about, she was very much particular about what it was that she was making. And that's why she didn't work with bands earlier. She didn't want to lose control. She didn't want somebody else to influence what it was that she was making. So she was very particular about who she brought on. And the people she brought on were the people who could enhance her process. People who could do things that she couldn't do, that would allow her to express very specific things that she was feeling that she couldn't express without that person. They became conduits for Joni on her records. And so that is what to look for in a collaborator. Somebody who's going to enhance your process, not somebody who's going to take over your process. But that also does not mean that collaborators can't bring new things to the process as well, right? Like, this is a balance you want to strike, is you want collaborators to bring new things to what it is that you're making, not take over the process, but you also don't want them to just be there to just be craftsmen. Like, the reason Joni doesn't like to work with producers is she says they hire a player for what he's played before. And I don't want a musician who recycles old licks. It's not going to thrill me unless he comes up with something that surprises him too. So in her process, she's not just looking for craftsmen, people who are good at what they do. She's looking for artists, because if Joni is going to be exploring, she wants her collaborators to be right alongside her, exploring as well. We talked about Wayne Shorter earlier, about how he was always pushing his saxophone playing to the limit, to the point of where he might make a mistake. And if he did make a mistake, he would be open to that mistake to see what it taught him and what it showed him about something new that he could do, that unplanned magic. But now that she's working with a band, she's not just bringing these people together and be like, yo, go explore on your own, see what you come up with, and we'll just put it into the song. Like, she has to be a leader. She has to guide her collaborators. And in order to effectively guide your collaborators, she needs to be, and like, you need to be very clear on what it is that you're making, right? Like, we talked about this a lot with the God of War season, is you basically have to create the sandbox that your collaborators play within. Because you're making a video game like God of War, which is huge in the scale, and you have hundreds of people working on it. How do you align all of those people to make something that is cohesive? And you do that by giving them very clear parameters. So the example is God of War Ragnarok, which is the most recent God of War game at the time of this recording, was directed by Eric Williams. And they had this design philosophy, which was called mythical realism. And it was a combination of three things. It had to be, I think it was Norse mythology, historical, like armor and stuff, or classical fantasy or something to that effect. And it had to check off one of those 3 boxes. And if it wasn't able to check off one of those 3 boxes, the design was removed from the game because it didn't fit within the world. So you need to be very clear on what it is you're trying to make, what it's supposed to feel like, create the parameters for your collaborators to play within, and then allow them to play in that sandbox that you've created for them. So here's Joni talking about this. As there was this musician that they brought into the process that was quite good, but he wasn't really playing within the parameters. She said, this is on the player Thomas Dolby. So on that level, we did have some problems because he'd get excited with some idea and I couldn't get him off the keyboards. Then I'd feel bad. I'd think, oh God, I understand. He's on a creative role, but he can't, because if he does that, he'll decorate me right off my own project. He may be able to do it faster. He may even be able to do it better, but the fact is it won't really be my music. And that is the thing that you have to look for in a collaborator and be clear with your collaborators on, is they may have great ideas. Like this Thomas Dolby might have a great idea for a song on the piano, but it all has to kind of come from Joni, or at least trace back to Joni, right? And that's where the parameters come from. The parameters are going to be set by Joni. They're going to be set by you if you're guiding the process, and it all has to funnel through that. So everything can be traced back to what it is you are trying to create and what you're trying to express. And the thing is with artists, when you're working with other artists, is they will actually appreciate that. Like artists love it when artists know exactly what it is that they want. So one of Joni's collaborators, Tom Scott, talking about this said, Joni can't talk to us in technical music terms, but that only intimidates us when someone who doesn't know what they're talking about tries to make comments. Joni's comments, whether they're in the language of a painter or the poet, her thoughts are clear. And if she says a little more yellow here, we'll try to work it out because we respect her talent and ability. They just respected the fact that Joni knew what she wanted. She wasn't like an artist doesn't want feedback of just, I don't like that. That doesn't do anything for anyone. And this isn't necessarily specific feedback what Joni's wanting, but they know that they are working towards something that she has in her head. She's not making it up on the go. Like she's able to give them feedback. They might not understand it, right? It might not be in a music language. It might be in, again, her speaking as a painter or a poet, but they know that she has something that she is guiding them towards. She may not have the exact words, but she's able to, like the exact technical words, but she is able to articulate her vision enough that they're able to get there together. Right. And like your job as someone who's guiding a creative process, whether you're a band leader, whether you're a director, is not to be able to do everyone's job better than them. Right. Like Joni wasn't guiding her process because she was the best saxophonist there. She wasn't the best keyboard player there. She wasn't even the best guitar player there. But she knew what she wanted, and she knew the tools enough and what the tools were capable of that she could work with the people who were better than her at those tools in order to create the sound she wanted. So it is your job as an artist, when leading a group of people, to understand the tools at a level that you can guide other people in using them better than you can. You don't have to be able to use every single tool. You just have to be able to communicate with the person controlling them. It's very similar to something that James Cameron does, right? Like James Cameron, for a very long time in his career, this is counter to the point I've made, but was better at every single phase of the filmmaking process than anybody else on his set. But as technology has progressed, especially when he's making a movie like Avatar, James Cameron does not know how to code better than the people on his team. But he knows what they're able to code, what the technology is capable of, so that he can communicate with the people who are coding to create exactly what it is he can see in his head. And what I love about the quote too, circling back to something quickly here, is where Tom Scott was saying how Joni sometimes communicates in the language of a painter or a poet when they're working on a song. And one thing that Joni has is she is an artist in every single area of her life. Like every single thing that of course she has her painting and her music, but even in the way she speaks, in her interior design, like everything for her was a form of a creative outlet. Like I even said, the way she speaks, like this is in Musician magazine from 1983. Joni speaks like she paints and composes. She's an ace storyteller right out of the Homeric tradition, not so much describing or analyzing a situation as conjuring up visionary landscapes of cinematic power that take the listener vicariously through the event. For Joni Mitchell, everything was a canvas. And this is like an interesting idea for you, right? It's like, how can you be more creative in every single thing that you do? How can you bring artisticness into your space, into your job, into the meals you cook, into the ideas you have, into the events you plan for you and your friends to do, or you and your partner to go do? Like, how can you be an artist everywhere? How can your art be a part of your life? How can you be an artist at all times? Keith Jarrett, we talked about this last time. Keith Jarrett was, again, an improvisational pianist, and he said he has to live improvisationally. He said, I came to realize recently that I can't let go of the essence of what's happening to me moment to moment just for the sake of etiquette. That means I'm as committed to spontaneity now as I would be playing the piano on stage. Spontaneity tells me what should be happening at this exact second. So if your questions don't fit into that, it's an impossible subject to deal with. In a way, the concerts preserve my life outside of the music and vice versa. And if I let either of them down, I'm sinning. So your environment, everything that you do should feed into your work in some way, shape, or form. And when we talked about this quote last time out with Keith Jarrett, I also mentioned Salvador Dali, who tried to live a very surrealistic life. Like every single thing he did was a canvas for him to project surrealism onto, including his own body, including his own face. His mustache was very surreal, and that was by design because every single thing Salvador Dali did had to be surrealistic. But by doing that, it fed into his art. His art fed his life fed his art, and around we go. And Joni Mitchell was the same way. She decorates her homes, of course, with her paintings, but she also would decorate them with the things that she loved. Like she would go and find these old antique pieces that she had collected and decorated her home with that. And I think what's interesting, what I love about that is like Joni Mitchell just loved what she loved. She never got caught up in not the rat race, but like celebrity not standoffs, but like she never got caught up with keeping up with the celebrity Joneses, like she was very clear on who she was and what she liked. Like she loved what she loved. Like this is how her house was described after becoming famous. Joni lives in a house filled with things she loves. Antique pieces crowd tables, mantles, and shelves. There are antique handbags hung on a bathroom wall, a hand-carved hat rack at the door. There are castle-style doors and Tiffany-stained glass windows, a grandfather clock that didn't work, and a priestly piano. Just everything in there is there because Joni loved it. And every single piece of furniture in her home and everything that decorated her walls told you something about her. And I think that that's important, to bring it back to Tyler, the Creator. Once again, there's this video, it's like 3 minutes. If you go on YouTube and search up like Tyler, the Creator collections, it's just him walking through the things he collects. He collects like old magazines, which I also collect, trunks, cars, bikes, pins. And he's just talking about these things that he collects that he loves. And I love that. Like just love what you love, because so often people don't fill their homes and fill their lives with things that they love out of fear, right? Like they want to be seen as cool and stuff. And they try to keep up with the trends, but they might not even like the trend. They might think they like the trend, but they haven't actually done the self-work to articulate what they like and why they like it. And so when I say love what you love, that comes down to being able to articulate why you love something. Like I look around my home right now, and if you're watching this on video, you see there's actually nothing behind me because I'm in a relatively empty room. But I look around my home and like nothing in this apartment tells you anything about me. It's very much like millennial gray. I'm not even millennial, but it's very much millennial gray. The couch says nothing about me. There's no art on the walls. Like it's very spare. Like I got very much into like the minimalism aesthetic that was like very popular in like 2017, 2018. And I look around now, I'm like, there's literally nothing in here that tells you anything about me and the things that I care about. And that's got to change, right? Because not only do you want to be artistic in every area of your life, but also just like love the shit that you love. And again, the reason people don't do that is because they're worried. People, I don't know what the fear is, that they're not going to be seen as normal or cool or relevant. I don't know. Joni says that she learned the mechanics of hip when she was 16. I played around with it from 12 to 16. I manipulated fashions. I had a column, fads and fashions, where I would start fashions and end them. By the time I was 16, I knew hip was a herd mentality. It's like saying you've got those 70s plants. What's 70s about a plant? The mentality is so sick and so rampant in America. People are so afraid not to be hip, so that's what a lot of the American marketplace is about. Shallow, stupid people keeping the economy going by being these frightened consumers. America works on fear. It's in, it's out. And that's interesting. Is like the reason we do these things is because we want to be seen as hip and cool. But like, I don't know. I think I'm at a point in my life now where it's like, I just want to have things in my home that, again, tell you who I am and what I care about. And I'm bored of this sparse house with nothing in it that tells you about who I am. And in order to always be hip, that means we always have to be kind of chasing the newest trend, what's popular, what's hip in the moment. And part of that, I think, kind of dovetails into this frustration Joni has, where she talks about like America's obsession with youth. And I think part of the obsession with youth is, one, obviously just there's a longing to be young again. And so we're paying attention to what the young people are doing. The young people are also dictating what is cool. And the young people are also just new and exciting, right? Like they weren't here before. Like a celebrity who's been around isn't exciting anymore because we're used to them. And so she talks about this obsession with youth. And I think what comes along with this obsession with youth is this like fear of having to make it by a certain point in time. And I mean, I certainly feel that. You know, I think I'm 27 right now at the time of this recording. I have this like weird internal pressure of like I have to make it by the time I'm 30. And this feeling has never gone away. Like I've always kind of been like, okay, well, I got to make it by the time I'm 20, by the time I'm 22, by the time I'm 25, but by the time I'm 30, like it just never stops. Like I have to make it by this certain date. And Joni was once approached by a group of, I think it was a bunch of teenagers. And they were talking to her, and basically what she was picking up was that they were all feeling like they had to make it by the time they were 21. And what Joni said to them was, you should see the Beatles now at 30 with all their glory behind them. Wouldn't you rather come to fruition later on in life, sort of slow and gradual, so you're still working towards something when you're 30? I am 30, and I look them right in the eye because 30, you know, to a kid is that magic number where you begin to fall apart or something. You don't have to necessarily make it early in life. And it's not cooler, but like there's obviously some benefits to being successful and rich in your 20s. I get that. But also like if I had made this show when I was 21, wow. I started my first podcast at 21. And even if you look at that, right, like this show never existed when I was 21. Because I didn't even know what I liked and what I wanted. And if I had gotten success off that first show, there's a chance I would still be doing that show today and not be as happy because I'm like dealing with this just like social media growth tactics still. And that's not what I'm interested in. I've evolved beyond that. And so by finding success later in life, it gives you the opportunity to evolve as a person and to kind of, as Joni said, come to fruition later on in life, slow and gradual. One, she thinks that you're still working towards something when you're 30, which is like, I don't necessarily know if that's the best advice, but like the crux of this being like, it's okay to make it when you're later in life. And this obsession with youth and newness, well, I mean, especially at the time, could have been relevant. But now, the internet, like you have such an opportunity always, no matter who you are, where you are, how old you are. And so it's okay to not have it made it by whatever arbitrary year goal you have set for yourself. I'm speaking as much to you as I'm speaking to me right now. I'm looking down the lens of the camera. I'm just going to quickly look at myself in the viewfinder and just reiterate that point. It is okay to make it later in life. It does not matter about the arbitrary year goal you have set for yourself. And there's something else with our obsession with newness as a society. It might be forcing us to overlook greatness in a sense. Like what Joni was saying is we just live in a society that has gotten out of hand on the newness factor. Just keeps getting ahead of itself. Like they get tired of a person's name or they get tired of a person's look and stop seeing him. Stop seeing that Michael Jackson is a brilliant dancer. Stop seeing his moves. Like, whoa, you know, like even if he keeps progressing, every generation has to be more shocking than the next. And I buy that. You know, that eventually we just get so bored of someone, we stop actually looking at what it is that they're making and we just overlook them entirely because we're used to them. And I think too that our perception of what is old and new in today's world is just getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so there's this fear of disappearing on social media. You know what I mean? Like, you have to be posting all the time so people don't forget about you. But I actually think if you continue to do that, you become a commodity. And so there might be something to the counter of that, where the way I've framed it on the show is like, to be delightfully rediscovered isn't a bad thing. You do not want to become a commodity. Now, the algorithms don't necessarily reward that, but I think from a longevity perspective, it's something to consider. Because the thing is, where I'm saying greatness is making us newness is making us overlook greatness, is we stop paying attention to the great stuff that we have in front of us for what is new. And then as a result of that, like, the average stuff gets amplified. Like, this Joni quote I'm about to read you is from the 90s, but I think it's just as relevant today. Everybody's a singer-songwriter now, but not everybody should be. Not everybody can do all of these things, and yet everybody does. And that's why I think music has gone downhill. It used to take three: a great lyricist and a great musician and then a great singer, like with Frank Sinatra. And that's why that stuff is so enduring, because you had three gifted people doing it. Now you've got people, they're not really a great singer or a great writer or a great musician doing all three. So the standards have dropped severely. And ironically, at the same time that the standards drop, the machines have increased. These people have 20 times the distribution. So the bad stuff is really everywhere. And again, this is in the 90s. I think this is even more relevant today, where the internet has done some amazing things. It has democratized opportunity. You can basically make music and distribute it no matter where you are or where you live. And I think that that is an incredible thing. However, there's also drawbacks to that. Like I said, as much music is uploaded in 2 days as was released in the entire decade of the 90s. There's got to be, the amount of bad stuff is exponentially growing quicker than the amount of great stuff. And because of that, the average stuff is like getting in the way of us ever finding the great stuff. And so average is getting amplified. You really have to, I guess really the point here is you have to be very intentional about what it is that you consume, which is the beauty of this show, is it forces me to spend a lot of time consuming great work. But day to day, most people don't really do that. And if I didn't have this show, I would do it a little bit, but not to the same extent. Like Joni's she's talking about hating interviews because she thinks it's degrading. I think it's a glut of crap. Why, when libraries are full of great words on pages, do people devour junk food? She's talking about junk food being the interviews in the magazines and stuff. And I just think that that's valid, right? Like, when you have the access to consume great work, why wouldn't you? And I think this is something you just have to do intentionally. And I think it's important for you as an artist to be consuming great work, right? Just so your quality bar stays high. You know, if you are, because you're going to compare yourself no matter what. You might say you're not comparing yourself to others. We all compare ourselves. You should make sure your frame of reference for what is actually great is calibrated correctly. Because if you spend your time just consuming a bunch of crap, your perception of what is actually good is going to be lower than someone who only consumes great work. And so the content you consume, the art you consume, influences you as an artist, both consciously and subconsciously. And I have to talk about this next point. Again, this is starting to get a little bit more negative than I would like it to. I just have to talk about this next point because it leads and connects perfectly into the point after and kind of sets up the rest of the ending of this podcast. But Joni was asked about Madonna. And whenever any Joni Mitchell articles or interviews where they asked her about Madonna, she's not like a big fan. I'll put it that way. And when she was asked to comment on Madonna, she said, no, I don't want to talk about it. But then she started talking about it. She said she has knocked the importance of talent out of the arena. She's manufactured, she's made a lot of money and become the biggest star in the world by hiring the right people. There's two things here. One, there is a lesson here that like the people you surround yourself with, like you gotta play the game a little bit, right? Like she's made a lot of money, became the biggest star in the world by hiring the right people, and she has knocked the importance of talent out of the arena. Talent still matters. Of course it does. And what Madonna did, I mean, I don't know a lot about Madonna. I would like to actually do a deep dive into Madonna at some point on the show. But she obviously had some form of talent, right? Like, you don't get to that level with no talent. The lesson here is in hiring the right people can make a big difference on your career, and the people you surround yourself with do matter. I do understand her frustration where so much of artistic merit today has nothing to do with art. But has it ever? Like, in modern society, has it ever? Even back in, I mean, I don't know enough about the 1400s in Italy to really comment on this, but in the Renaissance period, I was going to make a point about that was even influenced by business and the type of art people were buying and who bought what, made which painter popular. But business has always been a factor in art. You have to surround yourself with the right people to help you with the business side of things, and Madonna did that. But again, I do understand that artistic merit isn't entirely dictated by the art, and that can be frustrating to someone who is an artist. Has it gotten out of hand? Potentially. Like Joni, she believed it to be kind of like the death of the muse. Like, our focus on, because of Madonna as the leading example, that you can kind of like manufacture this, that it no longer became about the art. Like, people, we've talked about this, people don't necessarily create art because they like making art anymore. A lot of people are starting to create for the outcomes. And she was talking about this kind of into the 70s and 80s and into the 70s, into the late 80s and the 90s with Madonna. Like, she was seen as gotten really bad of people creating not for the love of the thing, not because of the muse, but because of, as she described it, the ick. The relationship between the musician and their muse has been usurped by an intermediary who is calculating demographics and polls. I saw one girl and she shoved her bosom at the camera and said, "I want to get my music to the world." And I thought, there's no muse in this. These are not creative people. These are created people. Fire. I mean, again, when we say like she speaks like a poet, there's a great example of that. Not creative people, but the created people. And I understand where she's coming from, especially the line too about the muse has been usurped by calculating demographics and polls. And that's a very real thing, right? Like, so much of what is made today is data driven. Like, what are the retention rates on this movie on Netflix? Okay, we need to make more movies like that because of the retention rates. And it's just replicating what is popular. You know, there's a reason there's so many spin-offs, sequels, and reboots. Part of the reason, obviously, is the fact that they look and they see, okay, people keep watching these. And we get so frustrated when they keep making spin-off, sequels, and reboots, but people keep going to watch spin-off, sequels, and reboots. So they're never going to stop making those three things if we continue to watch them. However, as somebody like Joni Mitchell, who is an artist, that can be frustrating, where you want new art to get an opportunity, but it's not because it doesn't fit into what the data is currently showing. But when you're trying, the thing with data is showing you what worked in the past. And when you're trying to create something new for the future, there isn't going to be data that is going to prove out that as a valid option. And the thing with that is you can have a lot of success just defaulting to craft. You can make a lot of money. You can get a lot of attention. But I think as an artist, you need to have higher standards than people's expectations. Like, as an artist who genuinely wants to try and push the culture forward and give people something new, you're not going to be able to do that if your standards are at par or lower than people's expectations. Your standards need to be higher than that. Not just of the audience, but even of your collaborators and the people you surround yourself with. You need to have the highest standards for your work of anybody else in the room and anybody else really in the world. Like, you need, if you want to be proud of the shit that you make, you need to make sure that you are making something worthy of being proud of. And you're only going to be able to do that if your standards are high enough. Joni once said she had cut "God Must Be a Boogeyman" song 3 times. She said great musicians would say you scrapped that tape because it was fine musicianship, but it didn't have that thing that makes your mouth fall open. And I like that as a good heuristic. Does it have that thing that makes your mouth fall open? And if it doesn't, why are you putting it out? And again, if you're a social media creator, we're talking about two very different things. That's a media play. This is art we're talking about. I don't mean to be offensive or reductive when I say social media is not art. I think social media, even YouTube, it's set up in a way that does not incentivize artistic pursuit. That's a conversation for a different day. This is for people who are making things that are meant to stand the test of time, ideally, right? When you're being a fine artist like Joni, where the more you watch something, the more you listen to it, the more you get out of it. It has to make your mouth fall open. And as you progress through your career, keep raising your standards. Not only should they be higher than everybody else's for your own work, but the next time you make something, your standards should be higher than what they were before. And just keep doing that. Joni said, I know what my standards are, and every time I met them, I raised them a little bit more. That's a good point too, right? Every time I met them, right? Like you might raise your standards to a point where the next time you make something, you might not actually quite reach them. You might not reach them the time after that, but the time after that, you might have gotten good enough now to reach those standards. So don't just raise them every time, raise them every time you meet them. Because what got you here won't get you there. It's like a very cliche saying, but it's very, very true. Especially as you start to deliver great work, people's expectations for what they expect from you are going to rise. So you always want to make sure that your expectations for yourself are exceeding people's. And as you deliver great work, their expectations are going to rise. So therefore yours should as well. And you want to keep your muse alive. We've talked about it throughout this entire deep dive. You want to be open to it. If you're just making decisions based on data and relying on craft, that is the death of the muse. So how do you keep your muse alive? Because I think you can only continually raise your standards if your muse is alive. Because if you're just relying on craft, you're going to be going back and doing what you've already done. You're just going to be repeating old habits. You're going to be anchored in place. And if that is the case, if you are anchored in place, how could you ever expect to exceed your standards? You won't. So the only way to keep your muse alive, or I should say the only way to continually raise your standards, is to keep your muse alive. And the way that Joni Mitchell says that you do this is that she said, I think that you keep your muse alive as long as you're open enough so that experience seems amazing to you and things continue to be magic. Right? We've talked about how you want to look at everything around you with a sense of awe and wonder, like a child. And I said we were going to revisit this idea of keeping your inner child alive, because that is the secret to keeping your muse alive, keeping your inner child alive, to continue be excited by everything, to be excited by the process. This idea that I become obsessed with is keeping the process playful. We've talked about keeping the process fun, and one way to do that is by keeping the process playful. I've thought of a lot of different ideas for stories, for screenplays, for books, and the ones that have stuck with me the longest, the ones that I enjoy revisiting the most, are the ones that I came up with when I was like 12 years old. Because the process, I wasn't writing or anything like that at the time, but the process for coming up with those ideas was by playing. I was very fortunate. My family, my ancestors, my granddad is from England. And so I have a lot of family in England. So I went to England a few times growing up as a kid. And so we had this box of swords in my back home, because we'd buy swords at these castles we go to in England, like these like wooden swords or plastic swords. So we had this bin full of like weapons, and I would play with them in our basement. I can picture this basement. It was unfinished. For some reason, there was purple stripes on the wall. There was a pool table in the middle of the room. And I would take these different swords and I would act out different scenes in these different stories that I would come up with. And these stories of very much along the lines of like, not Lord of the Rings, but like men fighting ogres, men fighting goblins, this like fights on mountaintops, and like all of these like fantasy ideas. And these ideas were come up with when I would just be playing in the basement. And these are the stories, when I look at my list of ideas, these are the ones I'm most fond of, because these are the story ideas I came up with when I was just playing as a kid. And I think that that is something we lose as we grow up. We lose this playfulness. And so it's so important to keep the process playful. And one of the ways you can keep the process playful and kind of like work at keeping your inner child alive is to continually ask questions. We talked earlier about how it's so important in your process to have these big unanswerable questions that you wrestle with. But you know who asks huge questions all the time? Kids. Joni said, I think that as long as you still have questions, the child questions, the muse has got to be there. You throw a question up the muse and maybe they drop something back on you. And it all kind of fits here, right? To keep your muse alive, you have to keep the process playful. You have to keep your inner child alive. You have to ask big questions nonstop like kids do. You want to make sure that life is fun. And it's playful and the process is playful. Joni said, sometimes I feel 7 years old. I'll be standing in the kitchen. All of a sudden, my body wants to jump around for no reason at all. You've seen kids that suddenly just get a burst of energy. That part of my child is still alive. I don't repress those urges except in certain company. And I think that is one of the big secrets to Joni Mitchell's success and just immense sustained creativity. Is she never let that 7-year-old part of her go. And that gets kind of smothered out of us as we grow up, right? As we conform to society. And it's so important to reclaim that part of yourself, because I don't think that it's gone forever. I just think it's dormant inside of you and you can bring that part of you back to life. And I think one of the best ways to do it, and one of the ways I'm trying to kind of get back in touch with my inner child, is this idea that I've been thinking a lot about of like what you liked. Like if you've lost your inner child, one of the ways to get back to it is to just revisit all of the shit you loved at 12 years old. Like when I think back, I was like, what did I like to do when I was 12? I liked to come up with these stories and I would act them out by myself in my basement. Maybe I should get a box of swords to keep in my office or something. I loved video games. I had some magazines. I collected comics. I had CDs. Like all of these things are starting to come back around. I'm starting to collect magazines again. I bought a CD player. I'm trying to play games again. But like these are the things that to help you reclaim your inner child is to just revisit the things you loved as a child that you let go for the sake of growing up. Because growing up's boring. Joni said, your joys are established in your childhood. And so therefore you need to revisit those joys and the inner child inside of you will start to be reborn. If your inner child is dormant, wake them up by revisiting the things that your inner child, or that you loved as an actual child. Because if you want to keep the muse alive, you have to keep the inner child alive. And one of the things that Joni did that I thought was really interesting. So Joni, and she had a stroke. She didn't think she'd be able to sing ever again. She wasn't really performing. She did these things called Joni Jams. And Joni Jams is where she would just bring a bunch of music friends over and they would just jam in her house. They'd sing songs, they'd play music. Every once in a while, Joni might actually try to sing a little bit. And this might not necessarily be something that she did when she was 12. But I think that, which again, I think the punchline is that obviously it's do the things you did when you were 12, but also like when you were 12, the reason you did things was with no ulterior motive. Like when I was collecting magazines, it's just because I thought they were cool. When I was playing games, it's just because I just loved games. When I was playing in my basement with these like story ideas, like I wasn't trying to turn them. I kind of thought about turning them into books because I was just dreaming big as a child, as you should, even to this day. You should be dreaming big. But you did these things like with no expectations on reality and what was possible. Everything was possible. But these Joni Jams, there was no ulterior motive to them. It was just her and some friends playing music and having fun. And if you're starting to take things too seriously, I think sometimes you just got to strip it back and have fun again. And it is from that place of fun that you can rebuild, because I think so many of us have gotten so serious, myself included. I'm a very serious person a lot of the time. it's not necessarily a trait I appreciate. But it's like, I feel like sometimes I've even forgotten how to have fun, how to let loose. And I think that's something that is so incredibly important as an artist. Because like we've talked about, if you're too serious, you're going to miss the magic moments. If you're too serious, you're going to be too rigid in your process. And it's not conducive to the muse. You've got to be able to have fun with these things again. And I think, as success happens, it's easy to become serious again. Like you become stressed about losing what you've had or what you've built, But I think if you become stressed about that creates an environment where, one, you're more likely to lose it because you're not going to do the things that helped you get there. You're not going to do the new things, right? I think you have to continually have fun with your success. I think part of having fun with your success is enjoying the success that you've earned. Joni, for a long time, she felt that she had to kind of like not hide the fact that she was starting to become wealthy, but like she didn't want to flaunt it. But then her whole perspective on it changed when she heard this line in a Leonard Cohen song where he said, "Do not dress in those rags for me. I know you are not poor." And Joni said, when I heard that line, I thought to myself that I had been denying, which was hypocritical. I had been denying, just as that line in that song, I had played down my wealth. If you are fortunate enough to have success making art, like doing this thing that you did as a kid and people are now paying you to do that, and you don't enjoy that, you're letting down the 12-year-old version of yourself. You're letting down all of us who are striving to have something similar who don't get to experience that. Sure, we might get a little jealous, but we would do the same thing if we were you. If you are lucky enough to have success, make sure you enjoy it. This is probably not the audience, maybe it is, to talk about Joe Rogan. Actually, it's definitely not on a Joni Mitchell one because she pulled her music off of Spotify when Joe Rogan's podcast signed an exclusive deal there. So this might not be the greatest example, and definitely not one she would probably be stoked to be related to. But I saw this clip of Joe Rogan talking about how he buys a lot of fancy cars now. And when he was explaining why he did that, he's like, because I got lucky enough to get, the way he described it, fuck you money. And he's like, if I could go back and tell like a kid Joe Rogan, and I don't believe Joe Rogan grew up super well off. He's like, if I could go back and talk to like 12-year-old me, and I told him we had fuck you money and I wasn't doing fuck you shit with it, if I wasn't buying the cars that I dreamed about, 12-year-old me would be disappointed. And so that's Joe Rogan's example. But like whatever that example is for you, if you are successful and you're listening to the show, if you one day are successful, make sure you enjoy it. Do not dress in those rags for me. I know you are not poor. And one thing to remember too, is it's not a zero-sum game, right? Like I talk about people, you might have success and you post or you do the things that you wanted to do because you are able to now, and other people might be jealous. And that's totally true. They will be. But you have to remember, it's not a zero-sum game. Like just because one person has success does not mean you can't have success, especially like with the internet, right? Like I feel like we rag on the internet a lot, you and I, on this show, but there are so many amazing benefits that have come from the internet. And one of them is the fact that it is not a zero-sum game. There are no gatekeepers anymore. And while I have my own thoughts about there are the negative drawbacks of that, it's also a beautiful thing where literally anyone, anywhere can get an audience for whatever it is that they're creating. It's not a zero-sum game. Even Joni at one point, she said, I have had a street musician playing guitar in the street telling me that I didn't pay any dues and his girlfriend was better than me and that she was going to dethrone me. I said, well, that's ridiculous. There's another throne waiting for her. Why do you have to kick me out of my chair? Get yourself your own chair. It comes at you in these ways. I love that. Get yourself your own chair. And the reality of the fact is, your chair is there. It's empty. It's just waiting for you to go and sit in it. You just have to do the work to get there. There's a chair waiting for you. if you're willing to go and get it. And on your path to sitting in your chair, or maybe you're sitting in your chair now, you're going to get knocked down repeatedly. And there's that famous quote from Rocky Balboa where life's not about how hard you can hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Joni Mitchell has been knocked down a lot in ways that she doesn't normally talk about. She when I say knocked down, I'm talking about with illness. She has had polio. She had some serious illness, I believe, in the 80s. She had another serious illness in the 2000s. She had her her aneurysm. But she keeps coming back. She never lets it get her down for too long. And I think of this quote of hers a lot when it comes to the setbacks we're going to face in life. When I think she was 9 when she had polio, and they told her, "You're never going to walk again." But she refused to accept that. And obviously, she eventually got up out of bed and walked out of the polio ward. And when she was asked how polio affected her, Joni Mitchell said, "I came back a dancer." I think that those 5 words are beautiful. Polio knocked her down, threatened her with never walking again, and she came back a dancer. And the way I interpret that line is when you get knocked down, come back from a hardship with a greater lust for life than you had before. And as we grow up, as our inner child becomes dormant, we tend to let hardship make us more pessimistic and more negative. But it does not have to be the case. You can come back a dancer. Hold on to that inner child worldview. The endless possibilities that you thought were there as a child still exist today. And when you're pursuing those possibilities, bad shit is going to happen. But when it does, come back a dancer. Thank you so much for listening to my deep dive into the life and career of Joni Mitchell. If you enjoyed this deep dive, do me a favor and send it to just one friend who you think would like it too. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the Artwell podcast, because next week I'm going to be putting up a bonus content episode which just has all of the material that I have that didn't make it into the deep dive. The document that I have for the bonus content episode is 10 pages long right now, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. And if you want to get even more out of the podcast, then make sure you subscribe to the Artwell newsletter, because next week I'm also going to be sending out a newsletter of all of the lessons that we talked about in the deep dive and the bonus content episode, written as these short little one-liners to make them memorable. You can find the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well. Are you still there? If you are, that means you made it to the special features. The special features is just something extra that I like to do at the end of every deep dive. That is sort of, I guess the best way to put it is my commentary on the art. A lot of what the deep dives are is talking about the artists themselves, the lessons they've learned, their spirit, and the things that we can take from them to apply into our own art. But I don't talk a ton about the actual art itself. And that's what I like to do with the special features. For example, some of the stuff I've done in the past is I've ranked James Cameron's movies. I gave a review of a movie about Salvador Dali's life. With the George Miller episodes, I did a review of the Mad Max video game. So I like to just pick something and give some piece of art related and give my thoughts or opinions on it in some way. And what I decided to do for Joni Mitchell is something I've done in the past, not for Artwell actually though. I once made a playlist of Queen songs that I am really proud of. And so what I decided to do for the Joni Mitchell deep dive is I was going to make a playlist of Joni Mitchell songs. It's not necessarily a greatest hits Although a lot of her greatest hits are on here, but some of them I had to cut. For example, like California didn't make it, and I'm a little sad with that because it's a great song, but it didn't fit thematically. And that's important to me because what I did with this playlist is I wasn't just making a playlist with a bunch of songs. I actually created a playlist, which I called Joni Mitchell, Love from Both Sides. I also designed a little cover art for this because that's just something fun for me. And what Joni Mitchell Love from Both Sides is essentially it's a love story. It's about two people falling in love, the man cheating on the woman leaving, and then eventually her kind of coming to the end of this journey of having been in a relationship, falling out of love with the, getting cheated on, leaving the relationship, and all of the kind of the processing that has to be done after an experience like that. And then coming to the conclusion of like, oh, I've seen love from both sides now. I've seen the love and I've seen the heartbreak. And so all of this entire playlist is using songs from Joni's first 6 albums. Thematically, they work the best. I also candidly didn't want to go through all 17 albums again, trying to put this playlist together. And her voice is also pretty consistent across these first 6 albums. So what I thought I'd do for the special features is I just wanted to tell you about this playlist if you want to go and listen to it. If you've never really listened to Joni Mitchell, I mean, this is a pretty good place to start. You're going to get a lot of her big hits are on here, but it's, again, a good combination of her first 6 albums. And what I would recommend you do if you've never listened to Joni before, listen to this playlist. It's a little long. It's like 26 songs, an hour and a half, but see which songs stick out to you and then go and listen to the actual album that those songs are from. But what I thought I'd do for the special features, and if you do want to listen to this playlist, it will be linked in the show notes. But what I decided to do with this special features was walk you through the entire playlist and talk about why I sequenced the songs in the way that I sequenced them. So this is one, if you're already a Joni fan, you can understand why I ordered them in this way. And if you're not a Joni fan and you're just listening to this, you can get a little context on the story that is being told here. I think the best way to do this, candidly, is like, go and listen to the playlist first. So pause this episode and go listen to the playlist and then come back and see how your reading on the playlist and the way in which I sequenced it compares to mine. I think it'd be kind of fun to do that. I know I talk a lot about on the show, how like artists don't tell you the meaning behind their songs because they want to leave it open to interpretation. And I think, I'm not an artist in this sense. I'm just organizing Joni's songs, but like, I think we can disagree on this, and like my opinion cannot be right versus like an artist will be right. So, but either way, I still think the most fun way for you to do this is to go and listen to the playlist, get your own thoughts on it, how I sequence it, and come back and listen to this. So we'll get into, I did a whole tangent about how I don't during the deep dives, but I just because the phone is in my hand. That's interesting. But anyways, what I thought I would do, what could be kind of fun, is to go through the playlist and kind of give you a breakdown of it. And so it opens with Court and Spark. And essentially Court and Spark is kind of like the beginnings of it all. It's like Joni. I mean, I guess I make this playlist thinking of Joni, but the woman meets a man and they kind of begin a little courtship, right? Like there's a little courting and sparking going on. Night in the City comes next. And Night in the City is kind of just like the representation of like a great date with this guy. They're in the city, they're having a great time. This third song, then it goes into Chelsea Morning, which is kind of like the day after the Night in the City. And then Help Me comes after that, which is kind of the realization of like, oh shit, I'm falling in love. Help me, please, I'm falling in love. Then we get into My Old Man, which is just a song about being in love and the guy she's in love with. Then things get a little bit interesting. So far, the playlist has been from the perspective of the woman, the perspective of Joni, we'll say, just to make it easy to follow. So for the first 5 songs is from Joni's perspective, but the 6th song doesn't actually have Joni in it at all in the story that I'm telling with this playlist. The 6th song is called Conversation, and it is from the perspective of a woman outside of this relationship between Joni and her man. And the conversation is just this woman who is interested in Joni's boyfriend and kind of wants to take him away from Joni. And this is like her perspective on their relationship and how they're just having, some conversation right now, but he is talking to her when he sees her. And there's definitely something happening here. She knows he's in a relationship, but she kind of wants to take him away from that. Car on a Hill is what comes after that. Now we're back in Joni's perspective, and Car on a Hill is kind of like the love. There's some cracks are starting to show in the relationship. Like Joni is at home and she's waiting for her partner, her boyfriend, to get home from from the bar that he works at, because my old man is a singer in a bar. And so the conversations that is happening in this story are happening in the bar. And so Carna Hill is Joni at home waiting for her man to get home. And he's not coming home like when she would expect him to. So she's kind of like waiting for his car to be coming up the hill. But like, where is he? Like, why isn't he coming home? The Pirate of Penance is more of a fable. And this is off Joni's first album, Songs to a Seagull, also known as just Joni Mitchell. And it's kind of a fable about this woman who knows something isn't right in her relationship, but is kind of choosing to be ignorant to protect her heart. But then All I Want comes after that. And All I Want is really like the doubt truly seeping in. Like, all she wants is to be in love with this guy, but she's not entirely sure if that's really what he wants. And so All I Want is, which is my personal favorite Joni Mitchell song, comes in at number 9 here to really just showcase the doubt seeping in, but like how painful that doubt is. The fact that, oh, this might be going away, but all I want is to just be with this guy. 10th song, Cold Blue Steel. And this is really kind of him. This is the decision where Joni's boyfriend makes the decision to cheat on her. You know, it's talking about like, well, going down the ladder into the dark, and like, we're just kind of like making the bad decision. And then Free Man in Paris comes after that, which is originally actually written about David Geffen, who was not openly gay at the time, about his experience in Paris. But this is kind of after cheating on Joni, her boyfriend's kind of just like, he feels free again. You know, he's not held down by anyone. Like, he can be a free man again. You Turn Me On My Radio is what comes next. And that one's kind of more like the realization of it not working for Joni, of her being like, look, I really like you, but if this isn't what you need, like, I just kind of need to know. And then the relationship is officially over with Just Like This Train, where, yeah, the relationship ends. And then I put Big Yellow Taxi next. And Big Yellow Taxi kind of feels like one of those songs, like, doesn't necessarily fit thematically with a playlist telling a story about kind of this rocky romance. But I think, one, I just really wanted to include it because it is Joni's biggest song, but I actually think it does work thematically right here because it's about this amazing, beautiful thing that is now just sad. We paved paradise and put up a parking lot, and paradise was the relationship and parking lot is the fact that the relationship is over. And there's also a line in the song about her man leaving in a yellow cab. And so that could be leaving the house. Well, I don't think that's leaving the relationship in the context of the song, but I think that's him going to the other woman's house, essentially. And then this Flight Tonight, which is just another song that I love, is about Joni having left. She's leaving. She's on a plane to another city, but she's regretting the fact that she left. And then Blue is I'm Sad It's Over. Marcy is the man realizing that Joni left. And there's a line at the end of the song that kind of made me think about this, but it's really about this woman being free, essentially what the song is about. And so Marcy, and then A Case of You is her being gone now, but she still misses him, you know? And then Raised on Robbery, which is kind of like the rebound song. And then Woodstock. And Woodstock is another one of those songs like I really, really wanted to include here. And thematically, again, it's not necessarily a song you would think would be on this playlist, but Woodstock comes after Raised on Robbery because to me, there's a line where she's like, I came across a child of God. And just in my head, when I heard that, I kind of like interpreted it as like she saw someone that she thought was her ex. And the song also has this like melancholic feeling to it. And so that's kind of how I interpreted it. Her seeing someone she mistakes for her past lover. And then after that, and also just, again, melancholic, it's great. Then it's I Had a King, which is kind of like her accepting of this is definitely over. Like she's kind of gone through the whole grieving process. She was sad it's over. She had the rebound. She is just thought she saw him with Woodstock and got excited, and she didn't. And so now I Had a King is like just accepting of being alone. Then Morning Morgantown comes after that, which is kind of like waking up after the heartbreak, now officially with the will to go on. Oh, sorry, I actually skipped a song. I Had a King, and then it's then after I Had a King is The Circle Game, which is with this acceptance of being alone now, she can finally move forward. Like life goes on. She could continually keep trying to like look in the past, but that's not how life works. She's got to move forward. That's the circle game. And then Good Morning Morgantown, which is her kind of like waking up with kind of having all of these realizations and now having the will to go on. Cactus King is her finally being free. And now that she is free, he actually kind of wants to get her back, but he can't do that because she's gone. She's free again. And then Both Sides Now, which of course is where the name of the playlist comes from, Love from Both Sides. And that is just her kind of being like, hey, like I went through this experience. I've seen life from both sides now. And the 26th song is more of an epilogue to the playlist because I feel like where it comes in this story is many years after this takes place. And it's her kind of running into him again for the first time in many years since their relationship ended. And that's the last time she would ever see him. And she kind of, in the song, she's like kind of telling how he married this other woman and stuff. And so it's really just like an epilogue to the story, but it's a song I enjoyed. And so I wanted to include it in here. So that is kind of my explanation for the sequencing of the songs on my playlist. Joni Mitchell, Love from Both Sides. If you listen to it, I'd like to hear what you think. This is a lot of fun for me to put together. I also like designing the cover art, like graphic design is something I just like to do. And so that is your special features, this new playlist for Joni Mitchell songs that if you're a fan, can be a way for you to kind of go through some of her big hits, especially the ones earlier in her career. And if you're new to Joni, this is a good way for you to kind of get into some of her music. So I hope you enjoy it. And yeah, that is the end of these special features. So now go do your thing, whatever it is, do it well.